Good evening, and welcome to another journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we go to witness something that began as simple as a woman stepping from her door on a July morning, something that grew into a mystery that scholars still cannot fully explain. We go to see what happened when dancing became something darker, something beyond choice, beyond reason, beyond anything the medieval world had words to describe. If you're new here, welcome to our quiet corner of the internet where history unfolds in gentle waves. Take a moment to like this video if it brings you peace, subscribe if you'd like more stories to carry you through the night, and leave a comment telling me where in this wide world you're listening, what time it is as these words find you. Are you watching stars appear outside your window? Or perhaps seeing the first hints of morning light paint your walls in soft gold? Now, let yourself settle deeper into whatever comfort holds you. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of a story that unfolds. Picture, if you will, the city of Strasbourg as it existed in that summer of 1518. Imagine walking through streets that had already witnessed 3 centuries of human joy and sorrow, where every stone had been placed by hands long turned to dust, where the great cathedral reached toward heaven with a spire so tall it seemed to pierce the very heart of God. This was a city that lived and breathed at the crossroads of cultures, where Latin prayers mixed with German merchant songs and French lullabies, where the past and present moved together like dancers in an eternal waltz. The houses rose before you in timber and stone, their upper stories leaning toward each other across narrow streets as if sharing secrets whispered from roof to roof. Each building bore the marks of its makers, the subtle signatures of craftsmen who had shaped wood and mortar into shelter, into home, into the framework that held human lives in its embrace. The smells of the city would have greeted you in waves, fresh bread from the bakers who rose before dawn, the green scent of herbs hanging in market stalls, the darker aromas of leather and metal from workshops where artisans practiced trades passed down from father to son across generations. This was a world where seasons ruled human life with absolute authority, where summer brought both abundance and anxiety. The harvest would determine whether the coming winter brought comfort or suffering, whether families would gather around warm hearths or huddle against the cold with empty bellies and fearful hearts. In July of 1518, the weight of this uncertainty pressed upon Strasbourg like heat before a thunderstorm, tangible and inescapable. The city pulsed with the rhythms of medieval life, each day beginning before sunrise with the bells that called the faithful to prayer, their bronze voices rolling across red-tiled roofs and down into courtyards where wells reflected fragments of sky merchants would soon follow, their wooden carts rumbling over cobblestones worn smooth by countless wheels, carrying goods from distant lands, spices that held the warmth of southern suns, furs that remembered northern forests, silks that whispered of journeys across mountains and seas. But beneath this surface of daily routine, deeper currents moved through the collective soul of Strasbourg. The Holy Roman Empire was a tapestry being rewoven by forces that pulled at its very foundations. Religious tensions stretched like overtaut strings, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Martin Luther had already nailed his questions to a church door hundreds of miles away, and those questions traveled like seeds on the wind, taking root in minds hungry for something new, something that spoke to their deepest longings for meaning and truth. The church bells that marked the hours also marked a world in transition, where old certainties crumbled like ancient mortar and new ideas built themselves into movements that would reshape the very understanding of faith, authority, and the relationship between the human soul and the divine. In Strasbourg, these tensions manifested not in grand proclamations, but in whispered conversations, in glances exchanged between neighbors, in the growing sense that the world they had inherited from their parents might not be the world they would leave to their children. Economic hardship wove itself through these spiritual uncertainties like thread through cloth, creating patterns of stress and anxiety that touched every level of society. The wealthy merchants who lived in houses adorned with carved saints and painted angels felt the pressure of trade routes disrupted by warfare and political upheaval. The craftsmen who formed the backbone of the city's economy watched their customers grow more cautious, more careful with coins that seemed to buy less each season. The poor, always the most vulnerable to forces beyond their control, felt winter's approach even in summer's heat, knowing that each day of prosperity could not be counted upon to return. It was into this world of layered tensions and unspoken fears that July arrived in 1518, bringing with it heat that seemed to press down upon the city like a great hand, making the air shimmer above cobblestones and turning the narrow streets into corridors of accumulated warmth. The cathedral's spire rose through this heat like a prayer made manifest in stone, its shadow moving across the city square with the patience of eternity, marking time in increments measured not in minutes but in the slow dance of light and shadow that had played across these stones since their first placement. In this city, where every family could trace their roots back through generations of the same streets, the same trades, the same seasonal celebrations that mark the passage of years, something was about to begin that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human behavior, about the relationship between mind and body, about the thin boundary between individual will and collective possession by forces that medieval minds could only describe in terms of angels and demons, blessing and curse. The houses stood ready, their windows like eyes that had seen everything and understood nothing, their doors about to open upon a mystery that would unfold not in the grand chambers of power, but in the simple domestic space where one woman would step from her threshold into a dance that neither she nor anyone who witnessed it could fully comprehend or control. The cobblestones lay waiting, about to receive footsteps that would echo through centuries, carrying with them questions that scholars would still be asking 500 years later in a world where dancing had become entertainment, exercise, art, but never again quite the terrifying force it was about to become in the streets of Strasbourg. For now, though, the city held its breath in the way that cities do, unconscious and eternal, its thousands of inhabitants moving through their individual lives without knowing that they were about to become witnesses to something that would challenge the very foundations of their understanding about what it meant to be human, to be rational, to be in control of one's own body and destiny. The morning of July 14th, 1518, began like countless mornings before it. The sun rose over Strasbourg with the same golden patience it had shown for millennia, its light touching first the highest point of the cathedral spire, then flowing down like honey over red tiles and timber frames, finally reaching the narrow street where Frau Trophäa lived in a house that differed from its neighbors only in the particular arrangement of its windows, the specific shade of its wooden shutters, the individual way its threshold had been worn smooth by the feet of its inhabitants. Her house stood among others of its kind, each one a testament to the human need for shelter, for boundaries, for a place where one could retreat from the public world into the private realm of family, sleep, and dreams. These houses had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, the ordinary miracles of daily life that accumulate over years into the substance of human existence. They held within their walls the accumulated breath of generations, the whispered prayers, the quiet conversations, the lullabies sung to children who would grow up to sing the same songs to their own babies, in rooms that echoed with the voices of the past. On this morning that would become the beginning of something unprecedented, Frau Trophäa moved through her house with the same routine that had shaped her mornings for years. Perhaps she broke her fast with bread and ale. Perhaps she tended to household tasks with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that each day brought its own requirements, its own small necessities that must be met before larger thoughts could claim attention. Perhaps she spoke with her husband in the comfortable shorthand of a marriage that had weathered seasons of joy and sorrow, developing its own private language of glances and gestures that needed no translation. What thoughts moved through her mind as she prepared to step from her door, we can never know. Did she feel some premonition, some stirring in her blood that spoke of change approaching like weather from a distant horizon? Or was her mind occupied with the ordinary concerns that fill the consciousness of women everywhere? Tasks to be completed, relationships to be tended, the endless small decisions that shape the texture of daily life. What we know, what has survived the passage of 5 centuries, is that she opened her door and stepped into the street, and that something in that simple action, that ordinary transition from private to public space, became the first note in a symphony of movement that would soon engulf her neighborhood, her city, her place in history. Her first steps may have seemed unremarkable to any observer who might have glanced her way. A woman emerging from her home, moving with the purposeful gait of someone attending to the day's business. But these steps carried within them a rhythm that belonged to no earthly purpose, a cadence that seemed to arise not from conscious intention but from some deeper source, as if her feet had suddenly begun to follow music that only she could hear. The movement began subtly, perhaps just a slight elongation of her stride, a barely perceptible shift in the way her weight transferred from foot to foot. But like a stream that begins as a trickle and grows into a torrent, the dancing claimed her body with gathering intensity, each step leading inevitably to the next, each motion creating its own momentum until she was no longer walking but moving in patterns that defied the practical geography of the street, tracing shapes that seemed to follow some invisible choreography written in the air itself. The dancing, once it began, seemed to possess a logic entirely its own, a mathematics of movement that operated according to laws unknown to the rational mind. Frau Trophaea's body became an instrument played by invisible hands, her limbs tracing patterns in the air that spoke of ancient rhythms buried deep in human memory, older than language, older than the cobblestones beneath her feet, older perhaps than the very concept of civilization itself. Her neighbors, emerging from their own morning routines, stopped to witness this strange transformation. At first, their faces might have carried the mild curiosity that greets any deviation from expected behavior, the same attention they might have paid to an unusual cloud formation or a bird singing out of season. But as the minutes stretched and the dancing continued, intensified, became something that clearly lay beyond the realm of choice or performance. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to concern, from concern to bewilderment, and finally to a kind of fearful awe. Here was a woman they had known for years, whose voice they recognized across the morning air, whose footsteps they could distinguish from those of other neighbors, whose daily routines had become part of the familiar rhythm of their shared street. Yet now she moved as if inhabited by something foreign, something that understood her body better than she did, that could command her muscles and joints to perform movements she had never learned, never practiced, never chosen to execute. The dance was neither graceful nor clumsy, neither beautiful nor ugly in any conventional sense. It existed in some space between categories, a manifestation of pure motion that seemed to bypass aesthetic judgment entirely. Her feet struck the cobblestones in patterns that created their own percussion, a rhythm that seemed to emerge from the earth itself and return to it with each step, as if the street had suddenly remembered its capacity for music and was teaching her body to become its instrument. Hours passed, and still she danced. The sun climbed higher in the July sky, its heat pressing down upon the city with increasing intensity, yet Frau Trophaea showed no sign of fatigue, no indication that the ordinary limitations of human endurance applied to her current state. Sweat beaded on her forehead and darkened her clothing, but her movements remained as fluid and continuous as water flowing over stones, as relentless as tides that answer to forces far beyond human understanding. Her husband appeared, drawn from whatever occupation had claimed his morning hours by neighbors who could no longer stand witness to this mystery alone. His face, when he saw his wife transformed into this creature of pure movement, registered a complexity of emotions that no single word could capture. Love and fear intermingled with confusion and desperation, creating an expression that spoke of a man watching the familiar world dissolve before his eyes. He called her name, first softly, then with increasing urgency, as if his voice might serve as an anchor to draw her back from whatever distant shore her consciousness had reached. But if she heard him, If some part of her awareness registered his presence, his pleas, his growing distress, no sign of recognition appeared in her movements. The dance continued with the inevitability of sunrise, of seasons changing, of all the great forces that move through the world without requiring human permission or understanding. He reached for her, his hands attempting to still her restless limbs, to break the spell that held her in its rhythmic embrace. But touching her was like trying to grasp running water or hold flame in bare hands. She moved through his attempts to restrain her with the fluid persistence of something that belonged more to the realm of natural forces than to domestic life. His touch seemed to pass through her without effect, as if she had become somehow insubstantial, transformed into something that existed in the same physical space as the solid world, but operated according to entirely different laws. The crowd of observers grew as word spread through the narrow streets with the speed that news acquires when it carries the weight of the unprecedented neighbors emerged from houses and workshops, their faces carrying the particular expression that people wear when confronted with something that challenges their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with the mixture of fascination and instinctive fear that the young feel in the presence of forces they cannot name or understand. Some in the crowd whispered prayers, their lips moving in familiar words that seemed suddenly inadequate to address what they witnessed. Others made signs against evil, their hands tracing protective symbols in the air as if gesture alone might shield them from whatever influence had claimed their neighbor. A few laughed nervously, the laughter of people who hope that treating something as amusing might rob it of its power to disturb the comfortable boundaries of their world. But as the day wore on and the dancing continued without pause, without apparent purpose, without any sign of natural conclusion, even the laughter faded into uneasy silence. This was clearly no performance, no temporary madness that would burn itself out and return Frau Tropea to her normal self with perhaps nothing more than embarrassment and exhaustion to mark the experience. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to draw its energy from sources that never tired, never depleted, never acknowledged the ordinary human need for rest and restoration. The afternoon shadows began to lengthen, painting the cobblestones in geometric patterns that shifted with the sun's progress across the sky. The cathedral bells marked the hours with their bronze voices, calling the faithful to their scheduled encounters with the divine. But even these sounds, which had organized the rhythm of city life for generations, seemed somehow diminished by the presence of this other rhythm, this percussion of feet against stone that acknowledged no human schedule, no earthly authority. As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of coolness and rest, the crowd that had maintained its vigil throughout the day began to show signs of the fatigue that Frau Tropea seemed immune to experiencing. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, rubbed their eyes, spoke in the hushed tones of people maintaining watch over something that might change unpredictably, dangerously, if left unobserved, yet none departed. Something about the spectacle held them as surely as it held the dancer herself, though their captivity was of the mind and spirit rather than the body. Her husband had not left her side, though his attempts to interrupt the dance had given way to a kind of protective hovering, as if his presence alone might serve as a barrier between his wife and whatever forces had claimed her. His face showed the wear of a day spent watching helplessly as someone he loved disappeared into a mystery he could neither solve nor share. He brought her water, though she showed no sign of thirst. He attempted to shield her from the more intrusive curiosity of strangers, though she seemed unaware of being observed at all. Night fell over Strasbourg with its usual gentle progression, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky like distant notes in a vast celestial composition. The city settled into its evening rhythms, windows glowing with candlelight, families gathering around tables to share the day's final meal, children being tucked into beds with whispered blessings and familiar lullabies. But in the narrow street where Frau Tropea continued her impossible dance, time seemed to have lost its ordinary meaning. The crowd thinned somewhat as darkness deepened, but many remained, drawn by a fascination that overrode their need for sleep, their responsibility to their own families, their desire to return to the comfort and predictability of their own homes. They lit torches and lanterns, creating a circle of flickering light that transformed the dancing woman into something even more otherworldly, her shadow multiplying and shifting across the walls of surrounding houses like the visual echo of movement itself. In this illuminated arena, Frau Trophea's dance took on new dimensions of mystery. The interplay of light and shadow created the illusion that she was not alone, that invisible partners moved with her, that her solitary performance was actually part of some vast cosmic ballet in which the visible world represented only a single dancer among multitudes. Her movements cast shapes on the walls that seemed to live independently, to possess their own rhythm and purpose, as if the dance was so powerful it could reproduce itself in shadow and flame. The night hours passed with the strange elasticity that time acquires during extraordinary events. Minutes could feel like hours, while hours compressed into moments, as if the ordinary mechanisms that regulated human experience had been temporarily suspended. Those who maintained the vigil found themselves entering a state that was neither fully awake nor asleep, neither entirely rational nor completely surrendered to the irrational, but something suspended between these familiar categories. Some reported later that they began to feel an almost magnetic pull toward joining the dance themselves, as if the rhythm that controlled Frau Trophea's movements was spreading through the air like a contagion of motion, seeking new bodies to inhabit, new instruments through which to express its mysterious purpose. They described the sensation as both terrifying and oddly appealing, a call that spoke to something deep within their own bodies, something that remembered movement as the first and most fundamental form of human expression. But on this first night, resistance held. The watchers remained watchers, observers of a phenomenon they could witness, but not yet fully join. Perhaps the novelty of the experience still allowed them to maintain the boundary between themselves and the dancing woman, to see her condition as something that had happened to her rather than something that could happen to anyone, that might even now be seeking its next victim among those who stood transfixed by its current manifestation. Dawn arrived with the same patient inevitability that had brought countless other dawns to Strasbourg, its light gradually replacing the artificial illumination that had maintained the night watch. But this dawn revealed something that challenged every assumption about human endurance, about the relationship between will and body, about the very nature of what it meant to be a person rather than a force of nature. Frau Trophea was still dancing. Her clothing was soaked with perspiration. Her hair had escaped whatever arrangement had contained it the previous morning. Her feet had begun to show signs of the punishment they were receiving from the unforgiving cobblestones, yet her movements retained their fluid continuity, their suggestion of being guided by intelligence and intention that operated beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness. If anything, the dance had gained intensity during the night hours, as if darkness had fed it, strengthened it, revealed aspects of its nature that daylight had previously concealed. The crowd that gathered for this second day included many who had not witnessed the beginning of the phenomenon, people who came expecting to find either a concluded mystery or an obvious explanation for what had initially seemed inexplicable. Instead, they found themselves confronted with something that daylight made no less mysterious, no more susceptible to rational interpretation. If anything, seeing the dance continue into a second day elevated it from the category of temporary aberration into something that demanded entirely new frameworks for understanding. Local physicians arrived, men trained in the medical knowledge of their time, equipped with theories about the balance of humors, the influence of celestial bodies on human health, the various ways that disease could manifest in unexpected symptoms. They examined Frau Trophea as thoroughly as her constant movement allowed, checking her pulse, observing her breathing, looking for signs of fever or other physical ailments that might explain her condition. What they found defied their diagnostic categories. Her pulse was elevated but steady, her breathing rapid but regular, her skin hot but not fevered in the way they understood fever. She showed no signs of the mental confusion that typically accompanied serious illness. no evidence of the physical weakness that should have resulted from such prolonged exertion. If anything, she seemed to possess a kind of supernatural vitality, as if the dancing was not depleting her energy but somehow generating it, drawing from sources that their medical training had never taught them to recognize or measure. The physicians consulted among themselves in the learned Latin that marked their professional discussions, but their scholarly language proved as inadequate as the vernacular speech of common observers when faced with something that existed outside the boundaries of established knowledge. They could describe what they observed, but description fell far short of explanation, and explanation seemed to require categories of understanding that their education had not provided. Religious authorities began to take notice as word of the phenomenon spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Representatives of the church arrived to assess whether what they witnessed fell within the realm of divine miracle, demonic possession, or some category that required entirely new theological consideration. They brought with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Christian thought about the relationship between body and soul, the ways that supernatural forces could manifest in the material world, the signs by which holy influence could be distinguished from its opposite. Yet they too found themselves operating at the edges of their expertise. The dancing woman showed none of the traditional signs of demonic possession, no blasphemous utterances, no supernatural strength, no aversion to holy objects or sacred words. Equally, her condition bore little resemblance to the ecstatic states they associated with divine visitation. No prophetic speech, no apparent spiritual insight, no message or meaning that could be decoded from her movements. She simply danced with a purity of purpose that seemed to exist entirely for its own sake, requiring no justification beyond the rhythm that drove it, seeking no goal beyond the continuation of movement itself. This simplicity, this reduction of human existence to its most fundamental element of motion through space, proved more unsettling to the learned observers than the most dramatic supernatural manifestation might have been. By the second afternoon, something new began to emerge from the crowd of watchers. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, began to sway slightly as he stood observing Frau Trophea's continuing dance. At first, his movements seemed unconscious, the kind of subtle response to rhythm that people often display without awareness. But gradually, the swaying became more pronounced, more deliberate, until he too was dancing, his feet finding the same mysterious rhythm that had claimed the woman, his body surrendering to the same force that had proven stronger than will, stronger than exhaustion, stronger than any ordinary human capacity for resistance. The crowd's reaction to this second dancer revealed the depth of their unease. Some backed away, as if proximity to the phenomenon increased their risk of falling under its influence. Others pressed closer, drawn by the terrible fascination of watching something unprecedented unfold before their eyes. A few called out warnings, pleas for the young man to stop while he still could, though their words seemed to have no more effect on him than similar appeals had had on Frau Trophea. Now there were two figures moving in the flickering space defined by the torchlight, their dances somehow coordinated, despite the absence of any visible communication between them. They moved as if responding to the same unheard music, as if following choreography that existed somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary senses. Their movements created a kind of conversation in the language of gesture and rhythm, a dialogue that needed no words, no conscious understanding, no rational framework to sustain its flow. The sight of two dancers where there had been one transformed the nature of the mystery. What had seemed like an isolated medical or spiritual crisis affecting a single individual now revealed itself as something with the capacity to spread, to reproduce itself, to find new expressions through different bodies while maintaining its essential character. The phenomenon had demonstrated that it was not bound to one person, not limited to one manifestation, but was something larger and more complex than anyone had initially understood. As the second night approached, the authorities of Strasbourg found themselves facing a situation that none of their experience had prepared them to handle. The city's leaders, men accustomed to dealing with the practical problems of governance, trade disputes, and maintaining order among a diverse population, suddenly found themselves confronted with something that seemed to operate according to entirely different rules, that acknowledged no human authority, that could not be negotiated with or legislated away. Emergency meetings were convened in chambers that had witnessed centuries of municipal decision-making, but the wisdom of ages seemed suddenly inadequate when applied to a problem that had no precedent in law, custom, or recorded experience. The dancing continued outside while inside. Learned men debated theories and proposed solutions that sounded increasingly hollow when measured against the simple, undeniable fact of two people moving in patterns that defied explanation or control. Some suggested that the dancers should be physically restrained, confined until whatever influence held them could be broken or exhausted. Others argued that such intervention might provoke the mysterious force to more dramatic manifestations, might anger whatever powers were expressing themselves through human movement. A few proposed that the dancers should be left alone entirely, allowed to continue until the phenomenon reached its natural conclusion, whatever that might prove to be. But as the debate continued and the dancing outside showed no signs of abating, a new concern began to emerge from the discussions. If the condition could spread from one person to another, if it possessed some quality of contagion that current medical understanding could not explain or predict, then the entire city might be at risk. What had begun as a curious local incident could potentially develop into something that threatened the stability, the very survival of the community as a whole. This possibility transformed the dancing from a matter of local interest into an urgent civic crisis. The safety of Strasbourg itself might depend on understanding and controlling something that had so far proven completely resistant to both understanding and control. The weight of this responsibility pressed upon the city's leaders like the summer heat that continued to build day after day, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension that seemed to feed the very phenomenon they hoped to contain. Meanwhile, the dancing continued with its own relentless logic, indifferent to human concern, human authority, or human attempts at interpretation. In the space illuminated by torches and lanterns, two figures moved through the night with the patience of natural forces, their feet wearing smooth patterns in the cobblestones, their shadows writing messages on the walls that no one could read but everyone could feel in the deepest chambers of their hearts. The third day dawned with a peculiar quality to the light, as if the sun itself had become aware of the strangeness unfolding in the streets below and approached its daily journey with unusual caution. The air carried a heaviness that went beyond the summer heat, a thickness that seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities, with the sense that the world was holding its breath in anticipation of something that had not yet revealed its full nature. Frau Trophea and the young man continued their impossible dance, their movements now so synchronized that observers began to speak of them as a single entity rather than two separate individuals. They moved as if connected by invisible threads, as if the space between them had become charged with the same force that animated their bodies, creating a field of influence that extended beyond their physical forms into the surrounding air. The crowd that gathered for this third day was larger and more diverse than before, including not only local residents but visitors who had traveled from neighboring communities after hearing reports of the phenomenon. Word had spread along the trade routes and pilgrimage paths that connected Strasbourg to the wider world, carrying with it the kind of urgency that accompanies news of the unprecedented, the miraculous, the potentially dangerous. Among the new observers were scholars from the cathedral schools, men trained in theology and natural philosophy who brought with them books and instruments, determined to apply systematic investigation to what they witnessed. They took careful notes, sketched diagrams of the dancers' movements, consulted astronomical tables to determine whether celestial influences might account for the phenomenon. Yet their scholarly methods, developed over centuries for understanding the natural world, seemed suddenly primitive when confronted with something that operated according to laws they had never encountered. Merchants who had arrived for the weekly market found their commercial purposes forgotten as they joined the vigil around the dancers. The buying and selling that normally dominated the city's rhythm seemed trivial in comparison to the mystery that played out in movements and gestures, in the percussion of feet against stone, in the visible demonstration that human existence contained depths and possibilities that commerce had never recognized or valued. But it was not only curiosity that drew these crowds. Many who came to witness the dancing found themselves struggling against something that pulled at their own bodies, that whispered in their muscles and bones about rhythms older than civilization, about movements that could express truths that language had never learned to speak. They described later the feeling of standing at the edge of an invisible whirlpool, sensing the current that sought to draw them in while fighting against its seductive pull. Some did not fight hard enough, or perhaps fought too hard and exhausted their resistance in the effort. By midday of the third day, a woman in her middle years had joined the dance, her initial hesitation giving way to the same fluid certainty that characterized the movements of the others. She entered the space where Frau Tropea and the young man continued their tireless performance, and immediately her body found the rhythm that connected her to their shared trance. Now 3 figures moved in the improvised arena, their individual dances weaving together into something that resembled a conversation conducted entirely in the language of gesture and movement. They seemed to respond to each other without conscious awareness, their bodies communicating through channels that bypassed rational thought entirely. When one dancer's movements grew more intense, the others would mirror that intensity. When one found a new pattern, the others would incorporate elements of that pattern into their own ongoing flow. The sight of 3 dancers where there had been 2 where there had been 1, suggested a mathematical progression that filled observers with a new quality of unease. If the condition continued to spread at this rate, how many would be dancing by week's end? How many by month's end? The arithmetic of contagion, usually applied to physical diseases, took on new and terrifying implications when applied to something that seemed to spread through observation, through proximity, through some quality of sympathetic response that no medical theory could adequately explain. The city's authorities found themselves facing decisions that had no precedent in law or custom. Should the area around the dancers be cordoned off, limiting access and potentially containing the spread of whatever influence emanated from their movements? Should the dancers themselves be forcibly removed from the public space, though previous attempts at physical intervention had proven completely ineffective? Should the entire district be evacuated, though such a measure would require explaining to the population what exactly they were being protected from, when no one could say with certainty what that was? Each option carried risks that were difficult to calculate because the phenomenon itself remained fundamentally incomprehensible. Moving against it might provoke it to more dramatic manifestations. Ignoring it might allow it to spread unchecked through the population. Attempting to study it might provide the knowledge needed for effective response, or might simply expose more people to its influence. In the end, the authorities chose a course that reflected both their desperation and their growing suspicion that conventional approaches to problem-solving were inadequate to the situation they faced. They decided to consult not only with medical and religious experts, but with the folk practitioners whose knowledge came from sources older than books, who understood healing and influence in terms that predated the formal categories of learned medicine. These wise women and cunning men arrived carrying herbs whose names were whispered rather than spoken aloud, whose properties had been passed down through generations of healers who worked at the margins of official approval. They brought with them knowledge of the moon's phases and their effects on human behavior, understanding of the subtle energies that flowed through the earth and could be channeled for healing or influenced by disturbance. When these traditional healers observed the dancers, their faces showed a recognition that the learned physicians and theologians had not displayed. They nodded to each other with the grim satisfaction of practitioners who had encountered similar mysteries in different forms, who understood that the human body contained capacities and vulnerabilities that formal education never acknowledged. One elderly woman, whose reputation for dealing with conditions that defied ordinary treatment had drawn people to her cottage for decades, watched the dancers with particular intensity before pronouncing her assessment. This was, she declared, a manifestation of what her tradition called the Great Dance, a condition that arose when the normal barriers between individual consciousness and the collective rhythms of life became temporarily dissolved. According to her understanding, such episodes occurred when communities faced stresses that could not be resolved through ordinary means, when the accumulated tensions of social, economic, and spiritual pressure sought release through the most fundamental human capacity for expression: movement. The dancing was not a disease in the conventional sense, but a symptom of imbalances that affected not just individuals but entire populations, seeking correction through whatever means presented themselves. Her explanation offered a framework for understanding the phenomenon, but it also suggested that the dancing might not be something to be cured or stopped, but rather something to be allowed to run its course until the underlying tensions that fed it had been discharged. This perspective challenged every instinct of the authorities who had been trained to see their role as maintaining order and control, who viewed any form of unregulated collective behavior as a potential threat to civic stability. As the fourth day began, the number of dancers had grown to 5, then 7, then a dozen. Each new addition followed the same pattern, initial resistance giving way to curiosity, curiosity becoming fascination, fascination transforming into an irresistible compulsion to join the movement that had already claimed so many others. The space required for the dancing expanded accordingly, the original narrow street proving inadequate to contain the growing company of bodies in motion. The dancers moved as a coordinated group while maintaining their individual variations on the central theme. Their movements created patterns within patterns, rhythms that intersected and diverged and converged again in ways that suggested some organizing intelligence behind the apparent chaos. Observers reported that watching the collective dance produced an almost hypnotic effect, that the eye could follow the movement of one dancer only to find itself drawn to another, then another, until the boundary between observer and observed began to blur. The physical toll of days of continuous movement began to show in subtle ways. The dancers' clothing was stained with perspiration and torn from the constant motion. Their feet left traces of blood on the cobblestones, though they showed no awareness of pain or injury. Their faces bore expressions of profound concentration, as if they were listening to music that required complete attention to follow, that could not be heard over the ordinary sounds of conscious thought. Yet despite these signs of physical stress, their energy seemed undiminished. If anything, the dancing appeared to feed on itself, each movement generating momentum for the next, each gesture creating the conditions for its own continuation. The longer they danced, the more natural their dancing seemed to become, as if they were gradually remembering skills that had been temporarily forgotten, recovering capacities that belonged to human nature but had been suppressed by the demands of civilized life. Food and water were brought to the dancers by family members and sympathetic observers, though consumption of these offerings occurred without interrupting the flow of movement. The dancers would drink while continuing to sway, would tear bread with one hand while the other maintained its rhythmic gestures. Even these basic necessities of survival became incorporated into the dance, transformed from interruptions of the rhythm into elements that served its continuation. The sight of people who had abandoned the most fundamental requirements of ordinary human existence, rest, shelter, productive labor, social interaction, in favor of pure movement began to affect the watching crowds in unprecedented ways. Some felt horror at witnessing what appeared to be the dissolution of everything that distinguished civilized humans from wild animals. Others experienced a strange envy, as if the dancers had discovered a form of freedom that the constraints of normal life made forever inaccessible. Children proved particularly susceptible to the influence of the dancing. Their parents found themselves maintaining constant vigilance to prevent their sons and daughters from joining the growing company of dancers, whose numbers now included people from every level of Strasbourg society. Merchants and craftsmen danced alongside servants and laborers. Young and old moved together in patterns that acknowledged no social hierarchy. no distinction based on wealth or education or family reputation. This leveling effect of the dancing phenomenon troubled the city's leaders almost as much as its mysterious nature. Social order depended on maintaining clear boundaries between different classes, different roles, different expectations for behavior. The dance seemed to dissolve these boundaries as completely as it dissolved individual resistance, creating a community based solely on shared movement, shared surrender to forces that recognized no human authority. Religious interpretations of the phenomenon began to evolve as its scope and persistence challenged initial assumptions. Some clergy proclaimed the dancing a divine judgment upon a city that had strayed from proper devotion, pointing to the recent religious upheavals as evidence of spiritual corruption that demanded supernatural correction. Others argued that the dancers displayed signs of demonic possession, that the coordination of their movements and their apparent immunity to fatigue suggested influences that could only originate in hell. A few brave souls proposed a different interpretation entirely, that the dancing represented a form of involuntary prayer, a way that souls too burdened by earthly concerns found to communicate with the divine. According to this view, the dancers had discovered, or been granted, a direct connection to sacred rhythms that normally remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. None of these interpretations provided practical guidance for addressing the growing crisis, but they reflected the depth of confusion and concern that the phenomenon generated among those responsible for spiritual guidance. The Church's traditional tools for dealing with supernatural manifestations, prayer, holy water, exorcism, pilgrimage, seemed inadequate when applied to something that showed no clear signs of being either holy or unholy, that existed in some middle realm between divine visitation and diabolic influence. As the first week of the dancing drew to a close, the number of participants had grown beyond any precise count. Estimates ranged from dozens to hundreds, depending on how one defined participation. Some moved continuously like the original dancers, while others joined the movement periodically before returning to more conventional behavior. Some maintained the fluid, trance-like quality that had characterized the early manifestations, while others seemed more conscious and deliberate in their movements, as if choosing to participate rather than being compelled by forces beyond their control. The economic life of the city began to show the effects of having so many residents engaged in activities that contributed nothing to productive labor. Markets operated with reduced efficiency as both sellers and buyers found their attention drawn to the ongoing spectacle. Workshops closed when their operators joined the dance or proved too distracted by it to maintain focus on their crafts. Even essential services like food distribution and waste removal faced disruption, as the personnel responsible for these tasks either joined the dancers or found their work complicated by the need to navigate around the expanding areas claimed by the moving bodies. City leaders found themselves caught between competing pressures. Citizens demanded action to restore normalcy, but no action they could contemplate seemed likely to be effective. Religious authorities called for spiritual solutions, but disagreed among themselves about what form those solutions should take. Medical experts admitted their complete inability to explain or treat the condition, while folk healers suggested approaches that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of authority and control. Meanwhile, the dancing continued with its own implacable logic, indifferent to human concern or intervention. In the spaces that had been claimed by movement, time seemed to follow different laws than those that governed the rest of the city. The dancers moved through day and night without acknowledging the distinction, their rhythms following patterns that owed nothing to the bells that had traditionally organized community life. Observers who maintained extended vigils reported that the quality of the dancing changed with the hours, becoming more intense during certain periods, more relaxed during others, following cycles that bore no obvious relationship to human schedules or natural phenomena. Some suggested that the dancers were responding to influences that operated on time scales larger than individual lives, that they had become instruments through which cosmic rhythms could manifest in the material world. Such interpretations, whether accepted or dismissed, reflected the degree to which the dancing had challenged every framework that the people of Strasbourg normally used To understand their world, medicine failed to explain it. Religion could not categorize it. Law could not regulate it, and common sense could not account for it. The phenomenon had revealed the limitations of all the systems of knowledge and control that civilized life depended on, leaving an entire community face to face with something that operated according to principles they had never encountered and could not begin to comprehend. Yet life in the city continued, adapted itself around the mystery that had taken root in its heart. People learned to navigate streets where dancers claimed certain spaces at certain hours. Merchants adjusted their routes to avoid areas where movement had become unpredictable and potentially contagious. Families developed strategies for protecting their members from exposure while satisfying their curiosity about what had become the dominant reality of their shared existence. The dancing had become, in its inexplicable way, a part of Strasbourg itself, as fixed and unavoidable as the cathedral spire, as persistent as the flow of the Rhine, as mysterious as the forces that had originally drawn human settlement to this particular bend in the river. It was transforming not just the individuals who participated in it directly, but the entire character of the community, creating new rhythms of daily life, new forms of social interaction, new ways of understanding what it meant to be human in a world where the boundary between choice and compulsion could dissolve as completely as morning mist touched by summer sun. The second week brought changes that would transform the dancing plague from a local curiosity into something that challenged the very foundations of how a medieval community understood reality, authority, and the relationship between individual will and collective force. The number of dancers had grown beyond what any reasonable observer would have thought possible, their movements now claiming not just the narrow street where Frau Trophea had first stepped from her door, but entire sections of the city's market square, spilling into side streets and creating currents of motion that flowed through Strasbourg like rivers of human movement. The authorities, faced with a phenomenon that had proven immune to every conventional response, made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most remarkable examples of institutional reasoning applied to an utterly unreasonable situation. Rather than continuing their attempts to stop the dancing, they chose instead to facilitate it, operating on a medical theory that dominated their understanding of how the human body maintained its balance of health and disease. According to the wisdom of their time, the dancing represented what physicians called hot blood, an excess of internal heat that sought release through violent motion. The cure for such conditions, they reasoned, lay not in suppression, but in encouragement, allowing the corrupted humors to exhaust themselves through sustained activity until the body's natural equilibrium could be restored. It was a logic that made perfect sense within the framework of medieval medicine, even as it led to consequences that no medical theory had anticipated. The city council, acting on this learned advice, authorized the construction of wooden platforms in the market square, raised stages that would provide better surfaces for dancing than the unforgiving cobblestones that had already begun to claim a toll in bloodied feet and injured limbs. They hired musicians from the surrounding regions, professional performers whose expertise in creating compelling rhythms would, according to the medical reasoning, accelerate the process by which the dancers would exhaust the forces that drove them. Guild halls were opened as shelters where dancers could rest between periods of movement, though few took advantage of these accommodations. Public fountains were designated for the dancers' use, ensuring they would have access to water without interrupting their participation in the collective trance. Food vendors were encouraged to position themselves near the dancing areas, creating an economy that could sustain the phenomenon while it ran its predicted course toward natural resolution. These official accommodations transformed the nature of the dancing itself. What had begun as a spontaneous eruption of inexplicable movement became something that resembled a festival, albeit a festival unlike any that Strasbourg had ever witnessed. The wooden platforms created focal points around which the dancers could organize their movements, stages that elevated individual performers while maintaining their connection to the larger rhythm that united them all. The musicians arrived with instruments that had been crafted specifically for dance music, drums that could provide the percussive foundation that human feet required, pipes whose melodies could guide bodies through complex patterns of movement, stringed instruments whose harmonies could weave individual dancers into collective choreography. Their professional skill in reading the mood and energy of their audience proved invaluable when applied to dancers whose responses operated entirely below the threshold of conscious choice. Yet the addition of external music to what had previously been purely internal rhythm created unexpected complications. Some dancers responded to the performed music as if it were exactly what they had been waiting to hear, their movements gaining clarity and purpose that made their previous dancing seem tentative by comparison. Others seemed disturbed by the external sounds, as if the music interfered with subtler rhythms they were following, songs that could only be heard in silence. This division among the dancers created a new dynamic within the phenomenon. Those who responded positively to the musicians gravitated toward the official platforms, their dancing taking on the qualities of performance even though it remained clearly involuntary. Those who preferred their own internal music moved to areas where the external sounds were muted, continuing their original style of movement in spaces that remained more private, more mysterious, more resistant to outside interpretation. The musicians themselves found their professional understanding challenged by audiences unlike any they had previously encountered. Dancers who never seemed to tire required music that could sustain energy levels far beyond the normal expectations of human endurance. Performers who responded to rhythms with supernatural sensitivity demanded precision and consistency that tested even experienced professionals. Most unsettling of all, the dancers seemed to anticipate musical changes before they occurred, their movements shifting in preparation for tempo changes or melodic variations that the musicians had not yet consciously decided to introduce. Some performers reported feeling as if they were not leading the dancing but following it, as if their instruments were being guided by the same forces that moved the dancers' bodies. They described the sensation of playing music they had never learned, of finding their hands creating rhythms and melodies that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their conscious knowledge or control. A few became so disturbed by these experiences that they fled the city entirely, carrying with them stories of music that played itself through human instruments, of rhythms that possessed the power to transform listeners into participants. But others found in the experience a deepening of their understanding of what music could accomplish, what purposes it could serve beyond entertainment or religious devotion. They discovered that certain combinations of rhythm and melody could induce states of consciousness that seemed to bypass ordinary mental processes entirely, creating direct connections between sound and movement that operated faster than thought. These musicians began to develop new techniques, new approaches to their art that incorporated what they learned from playing for audiences who heard with their entire bodies. The economic impact of supporting hundreds of dancers began to affect every aspect of the city's life. The cost of musicians, platforms, food, and medical care strained municipal resources that had been calculated to address conventional urban challenges. Trade relationships suffered as merchants from other cities proved reluctant to conduct business in a community where significant portions of the population were engaged in activities that defied rational explanation. Yet the dancing also generated new forms of economic activity. Visitors arrived from throughout the Holy Roman Empire, drawn by reports of phenomena unlike anything in recorded history. These travelers required lodging, food, and guides who could explain what they were witnessing, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who could adapt quickly to unprecedented circumstances. Some visitors came seeking cures for their own ailments, hoping that whatever force was manifesting in Strasbourg might also address their physical or spiritual needs. Others arrived as pilgrims, convinced that the dancing represented a form of divine communication that required personal witness to be properly understood. The influx of outsiders changed the character of the phenomenon itself. The original dancers, now joined by hundreds of local residents, found their movements influenced by the presence of observers from different cultural backgrounds, people whose expectations and interpretations created new pressures and possibilities for expression. Some dancers seemed to respond to this attention by developing more elaborate and theatrical movement styles, as if the presence of an expanded audience was drawing forth aspects of the phenomenon that had previously remained dormant. Others reacted in the opposite direction, their dancing becoming more inward-focused and withdrawn, as if the multiplication of observers threatened the purity of whatever experience had originally claimed them. These dancers sought out spaces that remained relatively private, corners and alcoves where they could continue their movements without feeling the weight of external scrutiny, areas where the original mystery could persist without being transformed by too much attention. The division between public and private manifestations of the dancing plague created new challenges for the authorities who were attempting to manage the situation. Public dancers could be monitored, supported, and potentially controlled through the provision of appropriate resources and facilities. Private dancers remained largely invisible to official oversight, their activities unknown and their needs unaddressed by municipal planning. Some families found themselves caring for relatives whose dancing had retreated into purely domestic spaces, creating burdens that individual households had to bear without community support. Medical theories about the progression of the condition began to evolve as physicians accumulated more data about its manifestations. The original hypothesis that sustained dancing would lead to natural exhaustion and recovery proved incorrect as weeks passed without significant reduction in the number or intensity of participants. Alternative explanations emerged, some focusing on environmental factors that might be sustaining the phenomenon, others exploring psychological mechanisms that could account for its contagious nature. A few physicians began to suspect that the condition might be related to ergotism, poisoning caused by consuming grain contaminated with ergot fungus. This explanation offered the advantage of being rooted in observable natural phenomena rather than supernatural forces, and ergot was known to produce symptoms that included convulsions, hallucinations, and compulsive movement. However, the theory failed to account for the highly coordinated nature of the dancers' movements, their apparent immunity to fatigue, or the selective way the condition affected some individuals while leaving others completely untouched despite similar exposure to food sources. Religious interpretations continued to proliferate as the phenomenon persisted beyond the time frame that medical interventions had predicted. Some clergy pointed to recent challenges to church authority, particularly the spreading influence of reformist ideas, as evidence that the dancing represented divine displeasure with religious innovation. Others argued that the coordinated movements of hundreds of individuals demonstrated the power of collective prayer, suggesting that the dancers had discovered a form of worship that transcended individual limitations and connected directly with divine will. A few radical voices within the religious community proposed that the dancing plague might represent the emergence of a new form of religious expression entirely, one that communicated through movement rather than words, through rhythm rather than doctrine. According to this interpretation, the dancers were not victims of disease or possession, but pioneers exploring territories of spiritual experience that traditional religious practice had never mapped or understood. Such interpretations created their own controversies within religious hierarchies, already strained by the broader challenges to church authority that characterized the early 16th century. The question of how to respond to the dancing became entangled with larger debates about the nature of religious authority, the validity of unconventional forms of worship, and the church's role in regulating spiritual experiences that seemed to operate independently of clerical guidance. Some bishops called for immediate intervention to suppress what they saw as dangerous departures from approved forms of religious expression. Others urged patience and careful study, arguing that premature condemnation might interfere with genuine divine communication. A few suggested that the church should attempt to incorporate the dancing into official worship, channeling its energy into forms that could be monitored and guided by religious authority. Meanwhile, the dancers themselves remained largely unaware of the theological debates their movements had generated. They continued their activities with the same focused intensity that had characterized the phenomenon from its beginning, their attention absorbed entirely by whatever internal rhythms guided their steps. Attempts to communicate with dancers while they were engaged in movement proved largely unsuccessful, as they seemed unable or unwilling to interrupt their dancing for conventional conversation. However, during brief periods when individual dancers would pause for rest or refreshment, some could be engaged in limited dialogue about their experiences. Their descriptions of the dancing proved remarkably consistent despite the absence of any apparent communication between participants. They spoke of hearing music that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, of feeling connected to rhythms that extended far beyond the boundaries of their individual bodies, of experiencing movement as a form of communication with forces that had no names in ordinary language. These accounts suggested that whatever was happening to the dancers involved fundamental alterations in their perception of reality rather than simple physical compulsions. They described their normal consciousness as feeling constricted and artificial by comparison to the expanded awareness they experienced while dancing. Time seemed to move differently when they were engaged in movement, with hours passing like minutes or minutes extending into what felt like hours, depending on the intensity and quality of the rhythms they were following. Most significantly, many dancers reported that their condition did not feel like an affliction or loss of control, but rather like a recovery of capacities they had forgotten they possessed. They spoke of their dancing as a return to something essential about human nature, something that civilized life had taught them to suppress, but that remained present beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, waiting for circumstances that would allow its expression. These descriptions challenged every assumption that observers had made about the dancers' experience. Rather than suffering from their condition, many seemed to regard it as a form of liberation, a temporary escape from the constraints and anxieties that normally dominated their lives. They expressed gratitude for having been chosen to participate in something that transcended individual limitations, that connected them to larger patterns of meaning and purpose than their ordinary roles as merchants, craftsmen, or housewives had ever provided. Such testimonies created additional complications for authorities attempting to develop appropriate responses to the phenomenon. If the dancers were not victims requiring rescue but willing participants in experiences they valued, then efforts to cure or stop the dancing might be not only ineffective but actually harmful to the people they were intended to help. Yet the broader community continued to suffer from the economic and social disruptions that hundreds of non-productive residents created, regardless of how those individuals felt about their own participation. The third week of the dancing plague brought developments that would test every theory, every intervention, and every assumption that had been applied to understanding the phenomenon. The number of dancers had stabilized at several hundred active participants, with dozens more joining and leaving the collective movement each day. The platforms and musical support that the city had provided had created an infrastructure that could sustain the activity indefinitely, transforming what might have been a temporary outbreak into what appeared to be a permanent alteration in the character of Strasbourg itself. Some families had adapted to having dancing relatives by incorporating support for their movements into household routines. Children brought food to dancing parents. Spouses took over responsibilities that their partners could no longer fulfill. Extended families reorganized themselves around the needs of members who had been claimed by the collective rhythm. These adaptations created new forms of community organization based on accommodating rather than curing the condition, accepting the dancing as a permanent feature of social life rather than a temporary disruption to be endured. Other families found the strain unbearable and began to leave the city entirely, seeking communities where normal patterns of life remained intact. Their departure created opportunities for newcomers drawn by curiosity or conviction that the dancing represented something spiritually significant, gradually changing the composition of Strasbourg's population in favor of those who could tolerate or appreciate the ongoing mystery. The city was transforming itself consciously and unconsciously into something unprecedented in medieval Europe. A community organized around the accommodation of collective trance, a place where the boundary between normal and abnormal consciousness had been permanently altered. Yet this transformation was creating stresses that threatened the viability of the community itself, challenges that no amount of adaptation could indefinitely postpone or resolve. It was at this point, when both the dancing and the community's response to it had reached a kind of dynamic equilibrium, that the authorities made their final, desperate decision to seek a solution beyond the realm of human medicine or municipal administration. They would turn to the saints, to the accumulated power of centuries of Christian devotion, to forces that operated in the same mysterious realm as the dancing itself. The stage was set for a confrontation between competing forms of supernatural influence, a test of whether the rhythms that had claimed so many bodies could be countered by the sacred geography of pilgrimage and holy intervention. The decision to seek divine intervention through pilgrimage marked a fundamental shift in how the authorities of Strasbourg understood the dancing plague. No longer could it be dismissed as a medical condition that would respond to earthly treatment, nor as a temporary social disruption that administrative measures could contain. By appealing to the saints, the city's leaders acknowledged that they were dealing with forces that operated in the realm of the miraculous, the supernatural, the territory where human understanding reached its limits and divine power began. The choice of Saint Vitus as the focus of their appeal carried deep significance within the religious culture of the time. Known as the patron saint of dancers, epileptics, and those afflicted with conditions that caused involuntary movement, Saint Vitus represented the Church's recognition that the human body could be claimed by forces beyond rational control, and that such claiming was not necessarily evidence of sin or spiritual failure, but might instead indicate a form of divine communication that required sacred intervention to interpret or resolve. The shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus lay in the hills surrounding Strasbourg, a journey that would normally require less than a day's travel for healthy pilgrims moving at a steady pace, but transporting hundreds of people who could not stop dancing presented logistical challenges that no pilgrimage had ever faced. The dancers could not be expected to walk in orderly processions, could not be contained within the normal structures that organized group travel, could not be predicted to maintain any schedule or follow any route that human planning could devise. The solution required the construction of special wagons, vehicles designed to accommodate passengers who would never be still during the journey. These carts were built with high sides to prevent dancers from falling out during particularly energetic movements, with soft surfaces to cushion the impact of bodies in constant motion, with canopies to provide protection from sun and rain for travelers who could not seek shelter in conventional ways. The wagons became mobile dance floors, platforms that could transport the phenomenon while allowing it to continue expressing itself through whatever rhythms guided it. Loading the dancers into these vehicles proved to be an undertaking that tested the patience and ingenuity of everyone involved. Some dancers seemed to understand the purpose of the journey and cooperated with efforts to guide them into the wagons, their movements adapting to the confined space while maintaining their essential character. Others appeared completely unaware of what was happening around them, so absorbed in their internal rhythms that external circumstances registered only as obstacles to be navigated without conscious attention. A few dancers resisted any attempt to interrupt or redirect their movements, as if the specific location where they had been dancing held sacred significance that could not be abandoned without spiritual cost. These individuals required careful persuasion from family members and religious authorities, gentle guidance that honored their apparent need to continue dancing while gradually shifting the context within which their dancing occurred. The procession that finally departed Strasbourg resembled nothing that the surrounding countryside had ever witnessed. Dozens of wagons filled with dancing figures created a moving festival of sound and motion that could be heard and seen from great distances. The dancers' movements, confined but not stopped by the wagon walls, created a percussion ensemble of extraordinary complexity as their feet and hands struck wood and fabric in patterns that seemed to respond to the rhythm of wheels on road, the pace of oxen pulling their burdens, the subtle changes in terrain that marked their progress through the landscape. Musicians accompanied the procession, their instruments now serving not to encourage or guide the dancing, but to provide a soundtrack for this unprecedented form of pilgrimage. Their music had evolved during the weeks of playing for the dancers, developing qualities that seemed designed specifically for bodies in constant motion, rhythms that could sustain energy over extended periods while allowing for the subtle variations that prevented monotony from overwhelming the experience. The religious authorities who organized and led the pilgrimage found themselves confronting theological questions that their training had never prepared them to address. Was the movement of the wagons itself a form of worship, carrying the dancers' involuntary prayers across the landscape toward their destination? Did the dancing represent a form of penance that the dancers' souls had chosen to perform, a purification process that required completion rather than interruption? Or were they transporting victims of demonic possession toward a confrontation with sacred power that would either heal or destroy them, depending on the spiritual state of their souls? The uncertainty created an atmosphere of tension within the pilgrimage leadership, a sense that they were participating in something that could have consequences far beyond their ability to predict or control. The journey itself took on qualities that transcended ordinary travel between two geographical points. Time seemed to move differently for the pilgrims, both the dancing passengers and their escorts, as if the entire procession had entered a realm where normal temporal relationships no longer applied. Hours could pass without anyone being fully aware of their passage, while single moments of particular intensity seemed to extend themselves across subjective eternities. The landscape through which they traveled appeared to respond to the passage of so much concentrated human energy and motion. Birds gathered in unusual numbers, their songs seeming to harmonize with the sounds emerging from the wagons. Wild animals emerged from forests to watch the procession pass, their behavior suggesting curiosity rather than fear, as if they recognized something familiar in the rhythms that filled the air. Even the weather seemed to cooperate with the journey, providing clear skies and gentle breezes that allowed the pilgrimage to proceed without the complications that rain or extreme heat might have created. Those who walked alongside the wagons reported feeling increasingly affected by proximity to so much concentrated dancing. The boundary between observers and participants began to blur as the journey progressed, with some escorts finding themselves moving in time with the rhythms that surrounded them, their own steps beginning to follow patterns that owed more to the dancer's influence than to the practical requirements of walking on uneven roads. A few individuals who had remained completely unaffected by the dancing plague during its weeks of manifestation in Strasbourg found themselves succumbing to its influence only during the pilgrimage, as if the movement of the wagons and the concentration of dancing bodies had created a field of influence more powerful than anything the stationary phenomenon had generated. These new dancers were quickly accommodated in the wagons, their addition to the collective trance seeming to strengthen rather than dilute the overall effect. The approach to the shrine of Saint Vitus occurred during the late afternoon of what had become a day unlike any other in the history of Christian pilgrimage. The site itself occupied a hillside clearing surrounded by ancient trees, a natural amphitheater that seemed designed by divine providence to accommodate gatherings of unusual size and character. The shrine building was small and simple, constructed of local stone and timber, notable more for its spiritual significance than for any architectural grandeur. As the wagons entered the sacred precinct, something began to change in the quality of the dancing they contained. The movements that had continued without interruption throughout the journey started to show signs of responding to the spiritual atmosphere of the place, becoming more focused, more intentional, as if the proximity to St. Vitus's presence was providing the dancers with something they had been unconsciously seeking throughout their weeks of involuntary motion. The process of unloading the dancers from their wagons required even more care than loading them had demanded. Some seemed eager to engage with the sacred space, their movements carrying them naturally toward the shrine building as if drawn by magnetic attraction. Others appeared reluctant to leave the confined spaces where they had found a kind of traveling stability, their dancing becoming more agitated and defensive as efforts were made to guide them into the open air. But gradually, through patient effort and gentle encouragement, all the dancers were gathered in the clearing before the shrine. their movements creating patterns of extraordinary beauty and complexity as they responded to the combination of sacred space, accumulated spiritual energy, and their own internal rhythms that had sustained them through weeks of continuous motion. The sight of hundreds of people dancing in perfect natural surroundings, their movements seeming to harmonize with the rustling of leaves and the songs of birds, created an impression of profound spiritual significance that moved even the most skeptical observers. The religious ceremony that followed challenged every precedent for how Christian worship could incorporate or address manifestations of the supernatural. Traditional prayers seemed inadequate when applied to a congregation that could not be still, could not assume conventional postures of reverence, could not respond to liturgical cues in ordinary ways. The clergy found themselves developing new forms of sacred ritual, approaches to divine communication that could accommodate bodies in constant motion while maintaining the essential elements of Christian practice. Holy water was sprinkled not in the usual formal manner, but in great clouds that could reach dancers wherever their movements carried them. Prayers were chanted repeatedly rather than recited once, creating soundscapes that could penetrate the altered consciousness of people whose attention was absorbed by internal rhythms. Incense was burned in quantities sufficient to fill the entire clearing, creating an atmosphere that could affect everyone present regardless of their state of awareness. The climax of the ceremony involved bringing individual dancers into direct contact with relics associated with Saint Vitus, sacred objects that were believed to carry the spiritual power necessary to break whatever supernatural bonds held the dancers in their involuntary movements. This process required extraordinary patience and sensitivity, as each dancer had to be approached in ways that honored their condition rather than fighting against it. Some dancers seemed to recognize the significance of the relics immediately, their movements becoming more calm and focused as the sacred objects were brought near. They would reach out to touch the reliquaries with gestures that suggested conscious intention rather than involuntary compulsion, their faces showing expressions of relief and gratitude that indicated some level of awareness had been maintained throughout their weeks of dancing. Others showed no immediate response to contact with the relics, their movements continuing with the same intensity and character they had displayed throughout the pilgrimage. These cases required extended application of the sacred objects, prolonged exposure to their supposed spiritual influence, patient repetition of prayers and blessings that might eventually penetrate whatever barriers separated the dancers from ordinary consciousness. As the afternoon progressed and the ceremony continued, observers began to notice subtle changes in the overall quality of the dancing that filled the clearing. The movements that had seemed so compulsive and unstoppable began to show signs of voluntary control, as if the dancers were gradually remembering that their bodies belonged to them rather than to forces beyond their influence. Individual dancers started to pause in their movements, looking around with expressions of confusion and surprise, as if awakening from dreams they could only partially remember. The process of recovery varied dramatically from person to person. Some dancers stopped moving suddenly and completely, their bodies finally finding stillness after weeks of continuous motion, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and relief that suggested the ending of a burden they had carried beyond their conscious strength. Others slowed their movements gradually, their dancing becoming less intense and compulsive until it resembled voluntary expression rather than involuntary compulsion. A few dancers seemed reluctant to abandon their movements entirely, as if the experience of dancing had provided them with something valuable that they were not ready to surrender. These individuals continued to move, but their motion now carried the quality of choice rather than necessity, dance as celebration rather than possession, expression of joy rather than symptom of affliction. Frau Trophäa, the woman whose first steps had initiated the entire phenomenon, was among the last to find stillness. Her recovery occurred gradually, her movements becoming less frenetic and more graceful until she was swaying gently in place, her eyes focusing on her surroundings as if seeing them clearly for the first time in weeks. When she finally stopped moving entirely, she looked around the clearing with an expression of wonder that suggested she had returned from a journey to places that ordinary consciousness could never visit. The silence that followed the cessation of the dancing carried a quality unlike anything the observers had ever experienced. After weeks of continuous sound and motion, the absence of rhythm seemed almost tangible, a presence in its own right that filled the clearing with peaceful emptiness. The natural sounds of the hillside, wind in the trees, bird songs, the distant murmur of a stream, seemed extraordinarily loud and clear, as if the ending of the human-generated percussion had revealed layers of environmental music that had been previously masked. The dancers themselves appeared to be experiencing a similar phenomenon of heightened sensitivity to their surroundings. Many stood perfectly still, their faces showing expressions of intense listening, as if they were discovering the world anew through senses that had been altered by their weeks of extraordinary experience. They looked at the trees, the sky, the shrine building, their fellow pilgrims, with eyes that seemed to see familiar things from entirely new perspectives. The return journey to Strasbourg proceeded in an atmosphere of quiet celebration and profound relief. The wagons that had carried dancing bodies now transported exhausted but recovered individuals who could hardly believe what they had experienced, who struggled to find words for memories that seemed to belong to someone else, to some other version of themselves that had existed during the weeks when their bodies had been claimed by forces beyond their understanding or control. Many of the former dancers reported that they retained no clear memories of their dancing period, recalling only fragments of sensation and emotion that felt more like dreams than actual experiences. They remembered music that had no earthly source, movements that had felt more natural than walking, connections to other dancers that had required no communication beyond shared rhythm. These memories carried a quality of profound meaning that the dancers could not explain but could not dismiss as unimportant. Others retained more detailed recollections of their experience, describing states of consciousness that seemed to expand far beyond the normal boundaries of individual awareness. They spoke of feeling connected to cosmic rhythms, to the rotation of the earth and the movement of celestial bodies, to cycles of time that encompassed seasons and years and generations rather than the minutes and hours that normally structured human experience. A few reported that their dancing had felt like a form of prayer more intense and direct than any they had previously experienced, a way of communicating with divine forces that bypassed the limitations of language and doctrine, that expressed truths too fundamental for words. These individuals seemed reluctant to describe their condition as an illness or affliction, preferring to speak of it as a temporary gift, an opportunity to participate in forms of worship that normal consciousness could never access. The city that welcomed the returning pilgrims was subtly but permanently changed by its encounter with the dancing plague. The platforms that had been constructed to accommodate the dancers remained in the market square, serving as reminders of the weeks when Strasbourg had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe. The musicians who had developed new techniques for playing to audiences in altered states of consciousness found their skills in demand for religious festivals and celebrations that sought to recapture something of the intensity they had witnessed. Most significantly, the community had discovered capacities for adaptation and accommodation that no one had suspected it possessed. The experience of supporting hundreds of non-productive residents, of reorganizing social and economic structures around unprecedented needs, of finding ways to incorporate mystery into the practical business of daily life, had revealed resources of creativity and resilience that would serve the city well in facing future challenges. The dancing plague of 1518 had ended as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind more questions than answers, more wonder than understanding, more appreciation for the depths of human experience than confidence in human knowledge. In the shrine of St. Vitus, through the application of sacred power to supernatural affliction, the impossible had been resolved. The inexplicable had been concluded, and hundreds of people had been returned to the ordinary world from realms of experience that defied every attempt at rational explanation. Yet the memory of those weeks would persist in the collective consciousness of Strasbourg, a reminder that the boundary between possible and impossible was more permeable than civilized life normally acknowledged, that human bodies contained capacities for transformation that could manifest under circumstances that no one could predict or control. that the relationship between individual will and collective influence operated according to principles that medical science and religious doctrine had only begun to explore. The aftermath of the dancing plague settled over Strasbourg like dust after a great storm, invisible but present in every corner of daily life, changing the texture of ordinary experience in ways that would take years to fully understand. The city that had witnessed the impossible found itself permanently altered by the memory of what it had seen, what it had accommodated, what it had ultimately resolved through means that challenged every assumption about the relationship between earthly problems and divine solutions. In the weeks following the pilgrimage to St. Vitus, the former dancers struggled to reintegrate into patterns of life that had once seemed natural but now felt strangely confining. Bodies that had moved continuously for weeks found stillness difficult to maintain, as if they had developed an addiction to motion that recovery could not entirely cure. Many reported restlessness that persisted long after their return, a subtle but constant urge to move that required conscious effort to resist. Sleep, which had been abandoned during the weeks of dancing, proved particularly challenging to resume. Former dancers would lie awake through long nights, their bodies remembering rhythms that no longer claimed them but had not entirely released them. Some found that they could only rest while engaged in gentle movement, rocking or swaying motions that echoed their dancing experience while remaining within the bounds of normal behavior. Dreams carried the residue of their extraordinary experience, filling their nights with visions of movement and music that felt more real than their waking hours. These dream dances often included encounters with other participants in the plague, suggesting that the connections formed during their weeks of shared trance had created bonds that persisted beyond the phenomenon's apparent conclusion. Former dancers would meet in the marketplace and recognize each other instantly, not by physical appearance, but by some quality of presence that marked them as fellow travelers in realms that ordinary consciousness could not access. The families of former dancers found themselves navigating relationships that had been fundamentally altered by the experience. Wives who had watched their husbands disappear into involuntary movement for weeks discovered that the men who returned were subtly but significantly different, carrying with them memories and perspectives that changed how they engaged with domestic life. Children whose parents had been claimed by the dancing reported feeling both relief at their return and a strange sense of loss, as if something magical had departed along with the compulsive movement. Marriages that had survived the strain of having one partner completely absorbed in dancing found new challenges in accommodating the changed person who emerged from the experience. Some former dancers struggled to find meaning in activities that had once provided satisfaction, as if their weeks of transcendent movement had revealed dimensions of existence that made ordinary concerns seem trivial. Others threw themselves into normal life with unusual intensity, as if trying to anchor themselves in routine after weeks of floating in realms beyond conscious control. The economic impact of the dancing plague continued to ripple through Strasbourg's commercial life long after the last dancer had found stillness. Businesses that had adapted to serve the needs of hundreds of continuously moving residents found themselves with specialized facilities and services that were no longer needed. The platforms constructed for dancing stood empty in the market square, their presence creating awkward spaces that disrupted the normal flow of commercial activity. Some merchants attempted to repurpose the dancing infrastructure for conventional entertainment, organizing festivals and celebrations that might make productive use of the stages and accommodations that had been built at such considerable expense. These events met with mixed success, as the community seemed reluctant to engage in recreational dancing that might accidentally trigger a return of the involuntary movement that had so recently been resolved. Musicians who had developed techniques for playing to audiences in altered states of consciousness found their skills both valued and feared. Religious authorities sought their services for ceremonies that aimed to create intense spiritual experiences, but worried that music powerful enough to induce transcendent states might also possess the power to recreate the conditions that had led to the plague. Secular celebrations avoided the rhythms and melodies that had been associated with the dancing, preferring safer forms of entertainment that carried no risk of unintended consequences. The the medical community struggled to incorporate their observations of the dancing plague into existing theoretical frameworks. Physicians who had witnessed hundreds of people dancing continuously for weeks without apparent harm to their health found their understanding of human physical limitations permanently challenged. The endurance displayed by the dancers suggested that the human body contained reserves of energy and resilience that medical science had never suspected, capacities that could be accessed under circumstances that remained completely mysterious. Some doctors attempted to develop new treatments based on what they had observed, theorizing that certain conditions might be cured through sustained movement rather than rest and medication. These experimental approaches met with limited success and considerable skepticism from colleagues who worried that encouraging patients to dance might risk triggering new outbreaks of the plague phenomenon. Others focused their attention on understanding the contagious aspects of the condition, seeking to identify the mechanisms by which observing dancing could lead to involuntary participation in the movement. Their investigations led them into territory that challenged the boundary between medical and psychological explanation, forcing them to consider possibilities that their training had not prepared them to evaluate. The question of what had actually happened during the dancing plague became a subject of intense debate among scholars throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Universities sent representatives to interview former dancers and witnesses, seeking to collect testimony that might support various theoretical explanations for the phenomenon. These scholarly investigations produced extensive documentation, but little consensus about the fundamental nature of what had occurred. Some academics argued that the dancing represented a form of mass hysteria, a psychological condition that could spread through communities under stress, manifesting in physical symptoms that appeared medical but were actually mental in origin. This explanation offered the advantage of remaining within naturalistic frameworks, avoiding the need to invoke supernatural causes, but it struggled to account for the remarkable coordination of the dancers' movements and their apparent immunity to ordinary physical limitations. Others proposed that ergot poisoning caused by contaminated grain had created the initial symptoms that then spread through suggestion and imitation. This theory provided a medical explanation that could account for the hallucinations and compulsive movement reported by participants, but failed to explain why the condition affected only certain individuals, while leaving others who consumed the same food sources completely unaffected. Religious scholars developed their own interpretations, ranging from divine visitation to demonic possession to a form of collective prayer that operated below the threshold of conscious intention. These spiritual explanations resonated with many who had witnessed the phenomenon, particularly given its ultimate resolution through pilgrimage and contact with holy relics, yet they raised their own questions about why divine or diabolic forces would manifest in such an apparently purposeless way, what message or meaning the dancing was intended to convey. A few bold thinkers suggested that the dancing plague represented something entirely unprecedented, a manifestation of aspects of human nature that civilized life normally kept suppressed, but that could emerge under specific circumstances that remained to be understood. According to this view, the dancers had not been victims of disease or possession, but pioneers exploring territories of human potential that ordinary consciousness could never access. The debate over interpretation was complicated by the testimony of the former dancers themselves, whose accounts often contradicted each other and sometimes seemed to contradict their own previous statements. Some described their experience as profoundly meaningful, a form of communication with forces beyond ordinary comprehension that had provided insights they could not adequately express. Others recalled nothing but confusion and fatigue, suggesting that their consciousness had been completely absent during their weeks of movement. These variations in remembered experience led some investigators to conclude that the dancing plague had actually been multiple different phenomena occurring simultaneously, that different participants had been affected by different causes and had undergone qualitatively different experiences despite the apparent similarity of their external behavior. This interpretation offered a way to reconcile contradictory evidence, but made any unified understanding of the event even more difficult to achieve. The records kept by city officials during the plague weeks became invaluable historical documents, though they revealed as much about the limitations of contemporary understanding as they did about the nature of the phenomenon itself. Municipal authorities had documented their decisions and actions with careful attention to legal precedent and administrative procedure, creating a detailed account of how an established government had attempted to respond to something completely outside the range of normal civic challenges. These official records showed the progression from initial dismissal of the dancing as a minor local disturbance, through growing concern as the number of participants increased, to desperate attempts at containment and cure as the situation threatened the stability of the entire community. The transformation of civic response from conventional law enforcement through medical intervention to religious pilgrimage revealed how quickly established institutions could be pushed beyond their capacity to function when confronted with truly unprecedented circumstances. Church records from the period provided additional perspective on how religious authorities had grappled with phenomena that challenged existing theological categories. The correspondence between local clergy and their superiors revealed deep uncertainty about how to classify and respond to mass behavior that seemed to operate in the realm of the supernatural but showed no clear signs of being either holy or unholy in conventional terms. Some letters expressed fear that the dancing represented a challenge to religious authority, a form of direct spiritual experience that bypassed the mediation of church hierarchy and doctrine. Others suggested that the phenomenon might be evidence of divine displeasure with recent religious innovations, punishment for communities that had been too receptive to reformist ideas. A few proposed that the dancing was actually a form of popular religious expression that the church should study and possibly incorporate into official worship. The resolution of the dancing plague through pilgrimage to St. Vitus provided retrospective validation for those who had interpreted it in religious terms, but raised new questions about the relationship between sacred power and mysterious affliction. If the dancing had been cured by divine intervention, did that prove it had been caused by supernatural forces? Or might natural conditions be susceptible to resolution through spiritual means regardless of their original causes? These theological puzzles became part of broader debates about the nature of miracles and the proper relationship between faith and reason that would characterize religious thought throughout the 16th century. The dancing plague became a case study cited by various sides in arguments about how Christian communities should respond to phenomena that seemed to operate according to principles beyond human understanding. Individual stories of recovery and reintegration provided the most human dimension of the plague's aftermath. Frau Tropea, the woman whose first steps had initiated the entire phenomenon, found herself both celebrated and avoided by her neighbors, regarded as someone who had been touched by forces that might still linger in her presence. She reported that her experience had left her with an enhanced sensitivity to rhythm and music that made ordinary sounds almost overwhelming in their intensity and complexity. Her husband, who had maintained his vigil throughout her weeks of dancing, struggled to relate to the woman who had returned from realms he could not imagine. The marriage survived, but required renegotiation of roles and expectations that had been established over years of conventional domestic life. Both partners had to learn to accommodate the changes that the experience had created in their relationship and in their individual understanding of what it meant to be human. Other former dancers found themselves drawn together by their shared experience, forming informal communities of people who could understand each other's struggles with reintegration in ways that those who had not participated in the dancing could not. These groups sometimes met to discuss their memories and dreams, to share strategies for managing the restlessness and sensitivity that persisted after their recovery, to explore whether their experience had provided them with insights or abilities that might be valuable to their broader community. A few former dancers reported that their weeks of continuous movement had left them with enhanced physical coordination and stamina that persisted long after the compulsive dancing had ended. They found themselves more graceful and energetic than they had been before the plague, as if their bodies had been trained by the experience in ways that conventional exercise could not match. Some became teachers of dance and movement, sharing skills that seemed to derive from their extraordinary experience. Others discovered that their relationship to music had been permanently altered, that they could hear subtleties of rhythm and melody that had been previously inaudible to them. These individuals sometimes found employment as musicians or music teachers, their enhanced sensitivity allowing them to create performances that carried unusual emotional power and could induce profound responses in their audiences. The children of Strasbourg who had witnessed the dancing plague grew up with memories that would influence their entire approach to understanding the world. They had seen adults engaged in behavior that defied every rule they had been taught about proper conduct, had watched their parents and neighbors transformed into beings who operated according to principles beyond rational explanation. These early experiences created a generation that was simultaneously more skeptical of authority and more open to possibility than their predecessors. Some of these children became scholars and artists, driven by curiosity about the boundaries of human experience that they had seen transcended during the plague weeks. Others became extremely conservative in their behavior, as if witnessing such dramatic departures from normalcy had convinced them of the importance of maintaining strict adherence to conventional patterns of life. The dancing plague thus created ripple effects that extended far beyond its immediate participants, influencing the character and development of an entire community in ways that would persist for generations. Strasbourg had become a city that had faced the impossible and found ways to accommodate it, that had discovered resources of adaptability and resilience that no crisis had previously revealed. Yet the memory of those extraordinary weeks also carried a quality of unease, a recognition that the foundations of ordinary life were more fragile than anyone had suspected, that the boundary between rational and irrational behavior could dissolve as suddenly as summer mist touched by morning sun. The dancing plague had ended, its participants had recovered, the city had returned to normal patterns of activity. But the knowledge that such things were possible could never be forgotten or completely set aside. In quiet moments, when the evening bells marked the end of another ordinary day, the people of Strasbourg would sometimes pause and listen, half expecting to hear again the sound of feet against cobblestones, the rhythm that had once claimed so many of their neighbors and had revealed depths of human experience that civilized life preferred to keep hidden beneath the surface of consciousness. The dancing plague of 1518 had become part of the city's identity, a defining experience that would be remembered and retold for centuries, carrying with it questions about the nature of human consciousness, the power of collective behavior, and the relationship between individual will and forces that operate beyond the reach of rational understanding or institutional control. As the months passed and seasons turned in their eternal cycle, the dancing plague of 1518 began its transformation from lived experience into historical memory, from immediate crisis into cautionary tale, from local phenomenon into something that would resonate through centuries of human attempts to understand the mysterious relationship between individual consciousness and collective behavior. The city of Strasbourg settled into rhythms that were simultaneously familiar and forever changed, carrying within its daily routines the knowledge that ordinary life contained possibilities that could manifest without warning, transforming the predictable into the unprecedented in the space of a single morning's first steps. The winter that followed the plague's resolution brought with it the kind of introspective quiet that allows communities to digest extraordinary experiences, to integrate memories that seem too large for ordinary consciousness to contain. Snow covered the cobblestones where hundreds had danced, creating a blanket of silence that muffled the sounds of normal commerce and conversation, allowing the city to exist for a few months in a state of peaceful suspension, as if the entire community were holding its breath while deciding what to make of what it had witnessed. Former dancers found the winter months particularly challenging, as the reduced daylight and enforced indoor confinement triggered memories of the weeks when they had moved continuously under sun and stars, when their bodies had known no boundaries between indoor and outdoor space, when the concept of shelter had become irrelevant to their experience. Many reported increased restlessness during the darkest months, as if the abbreviated days created an imbalance that their transformed nervous systems struggled to accommodate. Some developed what their families came to recognize as a seasonal sensitivity to rhythm and music that had not existed before their dancing experience. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors, the crackle of fires and hearths, even the rhythm of their own breathing could trigger episodes of intense longing for the movement that had once claimed them so completely. These individuals learned to manage their responses through careful attention to their environment, avoiding situations that might prove overwhelming while seeking forms of gentle activity that could satisfy their bodies' remembered hunger for motion. The musicians who had played for the dancers during the plague weeks found their careers permanently altered by the experience. Word of their unusual expertise spread throughout the region, bringing requests for performances at religious festivals, healing ceremonies, and celebrations that sought to create transcendent experiences without risking the loss of control that the dancing plague had represented. These musicians became specialists in what they privately called threshold music, compositions that could guide listeners to the edge of ordinary consciousness without pushing them beyond their ability to choose their own response. Their development of new techniques for inducing altered states through sound created a body of musical knowledge that would influence religious and secular performance for generations. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when an audience was approaching the boundary between voluntary and involuntary response, developing skills in modulation and pacing that could maintain intense experiences while preserving the safety of conscious choice. Some of these musicians reported that their time playing for the dancers had changed their own relationship to their instruments and to music itself. They described feeling more connected to sound as a physical force than they had previously experienced, more aware of music's capacity to influence not just emotions, but the fundamental rhythms that governed bodily functions. A few claimed that their playing had gained a quality of healing power that they could not explain but could not deny, as audiences frequently reported profound therapeutic effects from performances that incorporated techniques developed during the plague weeks. The scholarly investigation of the dancing plague attracted attention from universities throughout Europe, transforming Strasbourg into a destination for researchers seeking to understand phenomena that challenged existing categories of medical and theological knowledge. These academic visitors brought with them theoretical frameworks derived from classical texts and contemporary learning, but found themselves confronted with evidence that resisted easy classification within established systems of explanation. Interviews with former dancers revealed consistent patterns of experience that seemed to transcend individual psychology and suggest collective access to altered states of consciousness that no theory of mental illness could adequately explain. The dancers' reports of enhanced physical capabilities, expanded sensory awareness, and profound spiritual insights during their weeks of continuous movement pointed toward aspects of human potential that formal education had never recognized or studied. Some scholars proposed that the dancing plague represented a form of collective shamanic experience, comparing it to trance states documented among various indigenous cultures where communities would engage in prolonged ritualistic movement to communicate with spiritual forces or to heal social tensions that could not be resolved through ordinary means. This interpretation offered a framework for understanding the phenomenon as potentially beneficial rather than pathological, but required acknowledgement of human capacities that medieval European culture had no established methods for cultivating or controlling. Others focused their attention on the contagious aspects of the condition, seeking to understand how the observation of dancing could lead to involuntary participation in the movement. Their investigations led them to consider the possibility that human beings possessed forms of communication that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness, mechanisms of influence and response that could coordinate group behavior without requiring verbal or visual signals. These early explorations of what might now be recognized as collective unconscious phenomena represented pioneering attempts to understand aspects of human psychology that would not be formally studied for several more centuries. The scholars of the 16th century lacked the conceptual vocabulary to describe what they were observing, but their careful documentation of testimony and behavior patterns provided foundation material for future researchers who would develop more sophisticated approaches to understanding collective altered states. The religious implications of the dancing plague continued to generate debate within church hierarchies as reports of the phenomenon spread throughout Christian Europe. The fact that the condition had been resolved through pilgrimage and contact with holy relics provided evidence that some church authorities cited as proof of the effectiveness of traditional spiritual remedies. Yet the apparent randomness of who had been affected and the reports of profoundly meaningful spiritual experiences among the dancers raised questions about whether the phenomenon might represent a form of divine communication that operated outside established religious channels. Some theologians argued that the dancing plague demonstrated the need for greater emphasis on direct spiritual experience within Christian practice, suggesting that the dancers had accessed forms of worship and divine connection that formal liturgy had failed to provide. These interpretations resonated with reformist movements that were already challenging established religious authority, providing additional evidence for arguments about the validity of individual spiritual revelation versus institutional doctrine. Others maintained that the phenomenon represented either divine punishment for religious innovation or demonic influence designed to disrupt Christian communities during a period of theological uncertainty. From this perspective, the resolution of the plague through traditional pilgrimage validated the authority of established church practices and demonstrated the dangers of departing from orthodox approaches to spiritual life. These competing religious interpretations of the dancing plague became part of broader debates about the nature of spiritual authority and the proper relationship between individual experience and institutional guidance that would characterize the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation movements of the 16th century. The phenomenon provided a case study that various sides could cite in support of their positions about how Christian communities should understand and respond to apparently supernatural events. The economic lessons learned during the plague weeks proved valuable for Strasbourg's municipal administration in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The experience of rapidly reorganizing resource distribution to support hundreds of non-productive residents had revealed both the resilience and the limitations of the city's economic systems. Officials developed new approaches to emergency planning that incorporated the possibility of social disruptions that could not be predicted or prevented through conventional administrative measures. The infrastructure that had been constructed to accommodate the dancers was gradually repurposed for community activities that drew visitors and generated income for the city. The platforms built for dancing became stages for theatrical performances and musical concerts that attracted audiences from throughout the region. The accommodations developed for feeding and sheltering people in altered states of consciousness proved useful for hosting religious pilgrims and other travelers whose needs differed from those of conventional commercial visitors. Some merchants who had adapted their businesses to serve the dancing population discovered that their modifications had applications in other contexts. Vendors who had learned to provide food and drink to people who could not stop moving found their services valued at festivals and celebrations where conventional food service was impractical. Craftsmen who had developed techniques for creating clothing and equipment that could withstand continuous wear developed new product lines that appealed to travelers and workers whose activities subjected their possessions to unusual stress. The social innovations that had emerged during the plague weeks also persisted in modified forms. Families that had reorganized themselves to accommodate dancing relatives discovered that their new patterns of mutual support and flexible role assignment served them well when facing other challenges that required adaptive responses. The community networks that had formed to share information and coordinate care for the dancers evolved into ongoing systems of neighborhood cooperation that enhanced the city's social resilience. Perhaps most significantly, Strasbourg had developed a collective confidence in its ability to accommodate the unprecedented, to find creative solutions to problems that had no established precedents. This institutional memory of successful adaptation to extraordinary circumstances would prove valuable in facing future crises that required innovative responses rather than application of traditional methods. The children who had grown up witnessing the dancing plague began to reach adulthood with perspectives that differed subtly but significantly from those of previous generations. Having seen the boundaries of normal behavior dramatically transcended during their formative years, they approached adult responsibilities with both greater skepticism about the permanence of social conventions and greater openness to the possibility that human experience contained dimensions that ordinary life rarely revealed. Some of these young adults became artists and writers, drawn to create works that could capture something of the mystery and beauty they had witnessed during the plague weeks. Their paintings and poems carried qualities of movement and rhythm that reflected their early exposure to the possibility that art could serve as a bridge between ordinary consciousness and transcendent experience. Others became craftsmen and merchants who brought unusual creativity to practical problems, approaching their work with awareness that conventional solutions were not the only possibilities, that innovation could emerge from willingness to consider approaches that defied established wisdom. Their contributions to the city's economic and cultural life carried forward something of the spirit of adaptation and openness that the dancing plague had required and rewarded. A few chose religious vocations, seeking to understand through formal theological study the spiritual dimensions of what they had witnessed. These individuals often brought to their clerical training a grounding and direct observation of apparently supernatural phenomena that distinguished them from colleagues whose religious education had been purely theoretical. Their eventual contributions to religious thought and practice reflected integration of scholarly learning with witnessed experience of the mysterious. The medical community continued to grapple with implications of the dancing plague for their understanding of human physical and mental capabilities. Physicians who had observed the dancers' apparent immunity to exhaustion during their weeks of continuous movement found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about the limits of human endurance and the relationship between conscious will and bodily function. Some doctors began experimenting with movement-based therapies for conditions that conventional treatments had failed to address, reasoning that if dancing could serve as a symptom of mysterious ailments, it might also provide a cure for other forms of physical and mental distress. These early explorations of what might now be recognized as dance therapy produced mixed results but established precedents for thinking about healing in terms of restoring natural rhythms rather than simply suppressing symptoms. Others focused their attention on developing better methods for recognizing and responding to conditions that affected large numbers of people simultaneously. The dancing plague had demonstrated that individual medical problems could become collective challenges that required community-wide responses, forcing physicians to consider the social and environmental factors that might influence the spread of apparently psychological conditions. The documentation produced by medical observers during the plague weeks became valuable teaching material for training new physicians in the importance of careful observation and detailed record-keeping when confronting unfamiliar symptoms. The case studies derived from interviews with former dancers provided examples of how patient testimony could reveal aspects of illness and recovery that physical examination alone could never detect. As years passed and the dancing plague receded into historical memory, the stories told about it began to acquire the qualities of legend, with details being embellished or simplified to serve the narrative purposes of different communities and contexts. Parents used tales of the dancing to teach children about the importance of maintaining self-control and avoiding the influence of crowds that might lead them into dangerous situations. Religious teachers cited the plague as evidence of the power of prayer and pilgrimage, emphasizing the role that faith had played in ultimately resolving the crisis. The story became part of the repertoire of examples used to illustrate the effectiveness of traditional spiritual remedies and the dangers of departing from established religious practices. Secular educators drew different lessons from the phenomenon, using it to illustrate the importance of rational thinking and scientific observation in understanding unusual events. They emphasized the role that careful documentation and systematic investigation had played in managing the crisis and extracting useful knowledge from what might otherwise have remained merely mysterious. Each retelling of the story reflected the values and concerns of its tellers, gradually transforming the historical event into a multifaceted narrative that could serve various pedagogical and ideological purposes. Yet despite this evolution in the telling, the core mystery of what had actually happened during those extraordinary weeks remained intact, resistant to reduction to simple moral lessons or theoretical explanations. The dancing plague of 1518 had demonstrated that human communities possessed both remarkable fragility and extraordinary resilience when confronted with phenomena that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. It had revealed capacities for adaptation and creativity that normal circumstances never called forth, while also exposing the limitations of established systems of knowledge and authority when faced with truly unprecedented situations. Most profoundly, it had provided evidence that human consciousness itself contained depths and possibilities that civilized life rarely acknowledged or explored. That the boundary between individual and collective experience was more permeable than ordinary awareness suggested, and that the relationship between mind and body operated according to principles that formal learning had barely begun to understand. In the end, the dancing plague became part of Strasbourg's identity, not because it had been fully explained or its lessons completely learned, but because it had revealed something essential about the mystery of human existence itself. It had shown that life contained possibilities that could manifest without warning, that ordinary people could be transformed into participants in experiences that transcended every category of normal understanding, and that communities could find ways to accommodate even the most extraordinary challenges if they approached them with courage, creativity, and compassion. The memory of those weeks when dancing became something darker, something beyond choice or explanation, would persist as a reminder that the world contained more than rational minds could encompass, and that human beings possessed capacities for transformation that might emerge whenever the conditions were right for the impossible to become, if only temporarily, the inevitable reality of lived experience. The dancing plague of 1518 was not destined to remain an isolated historical curiosity, confined to the archives of Strasbourg and the memories of those who witnessed its extraordinary unfolding. As the decades passed and the 16th century gave way to the 17th, similar phenomena began to emerge across Europe, creating a pattern of collective movement disorders that suggested the forces unleashed in that summer of unprecedented dancing were part of something larger, something that spoke to fundamental aspects of human nature that civilization had never fully understood or successfully contained. These subsequent outbreaks, while never matching the scale or duration of the original Strasbourg phenomenon, shared enough characteristics to convince scholars that they were witnessing not random occurrences but manifestations of consistent underlying causes. In the Italian states, reports emerged of entire convent populations seized by compulsive movement that lasted for days, their dancing accompanied by religious visions and ecstatic utterances that challenged church authorities' ability to distinguish between holy rapture and diabolic possession. The nuns who participated in these episodes described experiences remarkably similar to those reported by the Strasbourg dancers. Loss of voluntary control over their movements, access to enhanced physical capabilities, and profound spiritual insights that seemed to emerge from states of consciousness far removed from ordinary awareness. Yet their dancing occurred within explicitly religious contexts, surrounded by sacred imagery and guided by liturgical music, suggesting that the phenomenon could adapt itself to different cultural frameworks while maintaining its essential character. In the German territories, traveling preachers reported encountering villages where entire populations would spontaneously begin dancing during religious services, their movements continuing long after the formal worship had concluded. These incidents often occurred during periods of social stress following poor harvests, outbreaks of disease, or conflicts between religious authorities that left communities uncertain about proper forms of spiritual practice. The dancing that emerged in these contexts carried distinctly apocalyptic overtones, as if the movement itself were expressing collective fears about the end of the world, the breakdown of social order, or divine judgment upon communities that had strayed from righteous paths. Participants spoke of visions of angels and demons battling in the heavens, of Christ returning to judge the living and the dead, of the earth itself joining in cosmic dances that would transform the material world into spiritual reality. These religious manifestations of the dancing phenomenon attracted the attention of authorities who were already struggling to maintain doctrinal unity during the upheavals of the Protestant Reformation. The sight of entire congregations seized by uncontrollable movement that claimed divine inspiration challenged established notions of how spiritual experience should be regulated and interpreted. Some reformist leaders saw the dancing as evidence that the Holy Spirit was working directly among the people, bypassing corrupt church hierarchies to communicate divine truth through physical expression. Others, both Protestant and Catholic, condemned the dancing as evidence of demonic influence designed to disrupt Christian communities during their vulnerable period of theological transition. The spontaneous nature of the outbreaks, their resistance to clerical control, and their tendency to spread rapidly through populations made them particularly troubling to religious authorities who were already facing challenges to their spiritual oversight. In France, the dancing phenomenon took on political dimensions as episodes occurred in regions where loyalty to central authority was already questionable. Entire towns would be seized by collective movement that seemed to express not just spiritual yearning but social rebellion, as if the dancing provided a form of protest that could not be easily suppressed or punished because it claimed to originate in forces beyond human control. The French authorities found themselves in the difficult position of responding to what appeared to be political dissent disguised as religious enthusiasm or medical condition. Traditional methods of maintaining order proved ineffective against crowds whose resistance took the form of continuous movement rather than violent confrontation, whose demands could not be negotiated because they emerged from altered states of consciousness that acknowledged no earthly authority. These politically charged episodes of collective dancing forced governments throughout Europe to develop new strategies for maintaining social stability in the face of challenges that operated according to principles unlike any they had previously encountered. The usual tools of statecraft, military force, legal sanctions, economic pressure proved inadequate when applied to populations whose behavior seemed to originate in realms beyond rational calculation or material interest. Some officials attempted to prevent outbreaks by restricting public gatherings, reasoning that the contagious nature of the dancing could be controlled by limiting opportunities for large numbers of people to observe and potentially join the phenomenon. These efforts met with limited success, as the conditions that seemed to trigger collective dancing episodes often involved precisely the kinds of social stress that restrictive policies tended to exacerbate rather than relieve. Others experimented with providing official outlets for collective movement, organizing festivals and celebrations that might satisfy whatever psychological or spiritual needs the dancing seemed to address while maintaining some degree of administrative oversight. These sanctioned events sometimes succeeded in channeling potentially disruptive energies into more manageable forms, but they also risked legitimizing and encouraging the very behaviors they were designed to control. The scholarly investigation of these recurring episodes gradually led to the development of new theoretical frameworks for understanding collective behavior that operated beyond the realm of individual rational choice. Early sociologists and psychologists, though they would not be called by those names for centuries to come, began to recognize that human beings possessed capacities for group coordination that could manifest without conscious planning or explicit communication. These proto-scientific approaches to understanding collective dancing phenomena represented pioneering attempts to study what would eventually be recognized as mass psychology, social contagion, and the role of altered states of consciousness in group behavior. The researchers of the 16th and 17th centuries lacked the methodological tools and conceptual vocabulary that would later be developed for such investigations. but their careful observation and documentation provided foundational material for future scholars. Some investigators began to notice patterns in the conditions that seemed to predispose communities to dancing outbreaks. Economic hardship, religious uncertainty, social conflict, and environmental stresses such as crop failures or disease epidemics appeared to create circumstances where populations became susceptible to collective altered states that expressed themselves through coordinated movement. These observations led to early theories about the relationship between social health and individual psychological stability, suggesting that communities under sufficient stress might develop collective symptoms that served as pressure release mechanisms, allowing populations to discharge tensions that could not be resolved through conventional political or economic means. The medical implications of recurring dancing phenomena also attracted increasing attention from physicians who were beginning to develop more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mental and physical health. The observation that entire populations could simultaneously develop similar symptoms suggested that illness itself might have social dimensions that individual-focused treatment could not address. Some doctors began experimenting with community-based interventions for conditions that seemed to spread through social contact, developing early approaches to what might now be recognized as public health responses to psychological epidemics. Their work laid groundwork for understanding how environmental and social factors could influence the development and spread of mental health conditions. The persistence of dancing phenomena throughout the late medieval and early modern periods also began to attract attention from those interested in the historical continuity of human behavioral patterns. Scholars who examined ancient texts found references to similar episodes of collective ecstatic movement in Greek, Roman, and earlier sources, suggesting that the capacity for communities to be seized by coordinated dancing was not a recent development but an enduring aspect of human nature. These historical investigations revealed that cultures throughout the world and across centuries had developed various methods for incorporating collective altered states into their social structures, creating ritualized contexts where entire populations could safely experience the kinds of consciousness transformation that occurred spontaneously and dangerously during episodes like the Strasbourg Plague. The comparison between controlled ritual dancing and uncontrolled epidemic dancing suggested that the phenomenon itself might not be pathological but rather a natural human capacity that became problematic only when it emerged without appropriate cultural frameworks to contain and direct it. This perspective implied that communities might be able to prevent dangerous outbreaks by providing legitimate outlets for collective ecstatic experience. Some progressive religious leaders began incorporating more movement and music into their services, reasoning that controlled opportunities for transcendent physical expression might satisfy whatever needs had been driving the spontaneous dancing episodes. These experimental approaches to worship created new forms of Christian practice that emphasized emotional and physical engagement with divine mystery rather than purely intellectual or contemplative approaches to spirituality. Secular authorities also began to recognize the potential value of festivals, celebrations, and other sanctioned occasions for collective expression in maintaining social stability. Communities that provided regular opportunities for populations to gather in large numbers for dancing, music, and other forms of coordinated activity seemed less susceptible to the spontaneous outbreaks that had caused such disruption in other regions. The economic implications of recurring dancing phenomena also became increasingly apparent as trade networks and commercial relationships were repeatedly disrupted by outbreaks that could paralyze entire communities for weeks or months. Merchants and bankers began to factor the possibility of such episodes into their risk assessments, developing strategies for managing business relationships with communities that had histories of collective movement disorders. Some entrepreneurs discovered opportunities to profit from the recurring phenomena by providing specialized services for communities dealing with dancing outbreaks. Musicians who had developed expertise in playing for audiences in altered states found steady employment traveling from town to town to assist with episodes as they occurred. Craftsmen who could quickly construct appropriate facilities for containing and supporting large numbers of dancing individuals created new trades that served this unusual market. The development of these specialized professions represented early examples of how societies could adapt their economic structures to accommodate recurring phenomena that initially seemed purely disruptive. Communities learned to anticipate and prepare for dancing outbreaks in ways that minimized their negative impacts, while potentially capturing some benefits from the intense spiritual and creative energies they generated. As the 17th century progressed and the dancing phenomena continued to manifest across Europe, patterns began to emerge that suggested the outbreaks might be following natural cycles related to broader social, economic, or environmental factors. Some investigators noted correlations between dancing episodes and astronomical events, weather patterns, or recurring political crises, leading to speculation about external influences that might trigger the conditions necessary for collective altered states. These early attempts at systematic analysis of the dancing phenomena represented pioneering efforts to apply scientific methods to the study of collective human behavior. While the conclusions reached by 17th century researchers were often limited by the theoretical frameworks available to them, their commitment to careful observation and documentation established precedents for more sophisticated investigations that would follow. The artistic and cultural influences of the recurring dancing phenomena also became increasingly apparent as the decades passed. Musicians, painters, poets, and writers throughout Europe began incorporating themes and imagery derived from the episodes into their creative works, creating new forms of artistic expression that captured something of the mystery and power they had witnessed or heard described. These artistic interpretations of the dancing phenomena often emphasized the beauty and spiritual significance of collective ecstatic movement while downplaying the social disruption and individual suffering that the episodes could cause through art. The dancing became transformed from a medical or social problem into a symbol of human potential for transcendence, connection, and liberation from the constraints of ordinary consciousness. The romanticization of the dancing phenomena through artistic representation contributed to changing attitudes about their significance and value. What had initially been understood primarily as a form of affliction or social problem gradually came to be seen by some as a manifestation of authentic spiritual experience that offered insights into dimensions of human nature that civilized life typically suppressed. This evolution in cultural attitudes toward collective ecstatic movement reflected broader changes in European intellectual life as the medieval worldview gave way to early modern approaches to understanding human nature and social organization. The dancing phenomena became part of ongoing debates about the relationship between reason and emotion, individual autonomy and collective experience, spiritual authority and personal revelation. By the end of the 17th century, the dancing phenomena had become sufficiently well documented and widely recognized that they formed part of the common cultural knowledge of educated Europeans. References to episodes of collective dancing appeared in literature, philosophy, and political theory as examples of human behavioral possibilities that any complete understanding of society would need to account for. The persistence and recurrence of these phenomena across different cultures, time periods, and social contexts had demonstrated that they represented something fundamental about human nature rather than mere historical accidents or cultural curiosities. They had revealed capacities for collective coordination, altered consciousness, and physical transcendence that challenged every assumption about the limits of human potential and the mechanisms through which communities could function and transform themselves. The legacy of the Strasbourg dancing plague thus extended far beyond the immediate experience of those who witnessed or participated in that extraordinary summer of 1518. It had initiated a process of discovery and investigation that would continue for centuries, contributing to evolving understanding of psychology, sociology, anthropology, and neuroscience as these disciplines developed the tools and concepts necessary to study the phenomena it had so dramatically revealed. The centuries that followed the dancing plague of 1518 would witness humanity's gradual development of new frameworks for understanding the mysterious event that had transformed Strasbourg into a stage for the impossible. As the Enlightenment brought with it an emphasis on rational inquiry and scientific methodology, scholars began to approach the historical records of collective dancing episodes with tools that their predecessors had never possessed, seeking explanations that could satisfy minds trained to demand evidence rather than accept mystery. Yet even as scientific thinking evolved and expanded its capacity to explain natural phenomena, the dancing plague remained stubbornly resistant to complete understanding. Each new theoretical framework that emerged seemed capable of illuminating certain aspects of what had occurred while leaving others shrouded in the same enigmatic darkness that had confounded medieval observers. The phenomenon had revealed something about human nature that transcended the categories available to any single discipline or approach to knowledge. Modern medical science, with its sophisticated understanding of neurology, psychology, and the complex interactions between mind and body, has offered several compelling explanations for what might have caused hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably for weeks. Ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus that can contaminate grain supplies, produces symptoms that include hallucinations, muscle spasms, and convulsive movements that could account for at least the initial manifestations of the dancing behavior. The theory of ergotism provides a naturalistic explanation that avoids the need to invoke supernatural causes, grounding the phenomenon in observable biological processes that can be studied and understood through conventional scientific methods. The alkaloids produced by ergot fungus are known to affect the central nervous system in ways that could produce both the physical symptoms and the altered states of consciousness that characterized the dancer's experiences. However, the ergot hypothesis struggles to explain several crucial aspects of the dancing plague that distinguish it from typical cases of mass poisoning: the remarkable coordination of the dancers' movements, their apparent immunity to exhaustion during weeks of continuous activity, and the selective nature of who was affected, while others who presumably consumed similar food sources remained completely unaffected, all suggest that biological poisoning alone cannot account for the full complexity of what occurred. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, offers another framework for understanding the dancing plague that has gained considerable support among contemporary researchers. This explanation focuses on the psychological and social mechanisms through which symptoms can spread through populations without requiring any underlying biological cause. According to this theory, the initial dancer's behavior triggered a cascade of imitative responses that propagated through the community via suggestion, social contagion, and collective stress. The psychogenic explanation aligns well with modern understanding of how social influence can affect individual behavior, particularly in situations where communities are already under stress from economic hardship, religious uncertainty, or other factors that might predispose populations to unusual forms of collective response. The phenomenon would represent a kind of social epidemic in which psychological rather than biological factors served as the contagious agent. This interpretation also accounts for the apparently voluntary aspects of some participants' involvement, the way that individuals could sometimes be influenced to join or leave the dancing through social pressure or environmental changes. It explains why the phenomenon could spread so rapidly through observation while remaining bounded within specific communities rather than affecting entire regions indiscriminately. Yet the mass hysteria explanation also faces challenges in accounting for the extraordinary duration and intensity of the dancing episodes, the remarkable physical capabilities displayed by participants, and the profound spiritual experiences reported by many dancers. Simple psychological contagion seems insufficient to explain how ordinary people could maintain continuous movement for weeks without apparent harm to their health, or how their altered consciousness could provide access to insights and abilities that normal awareness did not permit. Some researchers have proposed that the dancing plague represented a form of dissociative trance disorder, a condition recognized in modern psychiatric classification systems where individuals enter altered states of consciousness characterized by changes in identity, memory, and awareness of surroundings. These trance states can involve repetitive movements, apparent possession by external forces, and experiences that feel completely outside the individual's normal sense of control. The dissociative trance model offers a framework for understanding how the dancers could lose voluntary control over their movements while maintaining basic biological functions, how they could access enhanced physical capabilities while their normal consciousness remained suspended, and how they could report profound spiritual experiences that felt more real than ordinary reality. This explanation also allows for the possibility that the dancing served adaptive functions for individuals and communities under stress, providing a mechanism for processing trauma, expressing suppressed emotions, or accessing healing resources that conventional approaches could not reach. The trance state might represent not pathology, but a natural human capacity for consciousness transformation that emerges under specific conditions. Contemporary neuroscience has begun to reveal some of the biological mechanisms that might underlie the experiences reported by historical dancers and modern individuals who enter similar altered states. Brain imaging studies of people engaged in ecstatic religious practices, intensive dance, or meditation show distinctive patterns of neural activity that differ dramatically from normal waking consciousness. These altered brain states are characterized by reduced activity in regions associated with self-awareness and critical thinking, coupled with increased activation in areas linked to emotional processing, sensory integration, and motor coordination. The result is a form of consciousness that feels less bounded by ordinary categories of thought and more open to direct, non-rational forms of experience and expression. The neurological research suggests that the capacity for entering such states is built into human brain architecture, representing not an abnormality, but a potential mode of consciousness that can be activated under appropriate circumstances. The dancing plague might have represented a spontaneous activation of these latent neural capacities on a collective scale, triggered by environmental and social conditions that created the necessary psychological and physiological prerequisites. Anthropological studies of cultures that incorporate ecstatic dancing into their regular spiritual and social practices have revealed striking similarities to the experiences reported during the historical European outbreaks. Indigenous communities throughout the world have developed sophisticated understanding of how to induce, sustain, and safely conclude collective trance states that involve hours or days of continuous movement. These cultural traditions suggest that the capacity for collective ecstatic dancing represents a fundamental aspect of human nature that most modern societies have lost touch with rather than a pathological condition that needs to be cured or prevented. The spontaneous outbreaks that occurred in medieval and early modern Europe might represent attempts by stressed communities to access healing and transcendent resources that their cultures had not provided legitimate channels for expressing. The comparison with indigenous practices also reveals the importance of cultural frameworks for containing and directing collective altered states. Communities that have maintained traditions of ritual ecstasy typically surround these experiences with elaborate systems of preparation, guidance, and integration that ensure participants can safely enter and return from consciousness states that might otherwise prove overwhelming or destructive. The dangerous aspects of the historical European dancing outbreaks might have resulted not from the altered states themselves, but from the absence of cultural knowledge about how to manage such experiences safely and beneficially. The dancers were pioneering territory that their society had no maps for navigating, creating risks that more experienced cultures had learned to anticipate and minimize. Modern instances of collective altered states continue to occur, though they typically manifest in forms that contemporary culture finds more acceptable than uncontrolled dancing in public spaces, large-scale musical events, religious gatherings, and even sporting events sometimes generate collective experiences that share characteristics with the historical dancing phenomena, suggesting that the underlying human capacities remain active even if their expressions have evolved. Electronic dance music culture, in particular, has created contexts where thousands of people can engage in hours of continuous movement while experiencing altered states of consciousness that participants often describe in terms remarkably similar to those used by historical dancers. The combination of repetitive rhythms, group synchronization, and sustained physical activity can produce transcendent experiences that feel both intensely personal and profoundly collective. These modern manifestations suggest that the human need for collective ecstatic experience has not disappeared, but has found new outlets that contemporary society can accommodate more easily than the spontaneous outbreaks that terrorized medieval communities. The development of structured contexts for collective altered states might represent a form of cultural learning about how to satisfy deep psychological and spiritual needs while maintaining social stability. The persistence of collective movement phenomena across cultures and centuries points towards something essential about human nature that transcends specific historical circumstances or cultural conditions. Whether understood through medical, psychological, neurological, or anthropological frameworks, the dancing plague of 1518 revealed capacities for collective coordination and consciousness transformation that appear to be fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. Perhaps the most profound lesson that emerges from studying the dancing plague and its historical legacy is the recognition that human consciousness itself is far more flexible, mysterious, and collectively interconnected than modern individualistic cultures typically acknowledge. The boundary between self and other, between voluntary and involuntary action, between ordinary and extraordinary experience, proves to be much more permeable than everyday awareness suggests. The dancers of Strasbourg became pioneers in exploring territories of human potential that their society had no frameworks for understanding or integrating. Their experiences challenged every assumption about the relationship between mind and body, individual will and collective influence, rational thought and direct spiritual insight. In doing so, they revealed that human nature contains depths and possibilities that even centuries of subsequent investigation have not fully mapped or comprehended. Their legacy lives on not only in historical records and scholarly theories, but in the persistent human hunger for experiences that transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness, that connect individuals to larger patterns of meaning and purpose, that reveal the extraordinary capacities hidden within apparently ordinary lives. Every generation seems to rediscover, in its own way, the same fundamental truths about human nature that the dancing plague of 1518 demonstrated so dramatically in the streets of a medieval city. The mystery endures because it points towards something eternal about the human condition, the capacity for transformation, the hunger for transcendence, the deep interconnectedness that binds individuals into collective experiences that can lift entire communities beyond the constraints of what they thought possible. In dancing beyond the boundaries of choice, beyond the limits of endurance, beyond the categories of explanation, the people of Strasbourg touched something essential about what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to be part of the vast, mysterious dance of existence itself. Today, as we settle into the quiet rhythms of rest, as our own bodies find stillness after the day's movements, we can perhaps appreciate the profound courage it took for those long-ago dancers to surrender so completely to forces they could not understand or control. They became, for those extraordinary weeks, pure embodiments of movement and rhythm, living demonstrations that human life contains possibilities that rational thought alone can never fully encompass or predict. Their dance has ended, their movements have stilled, their mystery has become memory, yet something of their discovery lives on in every moment when we find ourselves moved by music we cannot resist, touched by beauty that transcends understanding, connected to others through bonds that operate faster than thought and deeper than words. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that we are more than we know, that consciousness itself is vaster and more wonderful than ordinary experience reveals, that the human capacity for transformation and transcendence remains as alive today as it was 5 centuries ago when a woman named Frau Trophea stepped from her door and began to dance. In the quiet hours of reflection that follow extraordinary events, when the immediate urgency of crisis has passed and communities begin the slow work of integration and understanding, certain truths emerge that can only be perceived in stillness. The dancing plague of 1518, like all profound mysteries, continues to reveal new layers of meaning as we contemplate its legacy from the vantage point of centuries, from the perspective of minds trained in disciplines that did not exist when Frau Troffea first stepped into the street and began her impossible dance. Perhaps what makes the phenomenon so enduringly fascinating is not any single aspect of what occurred, but rather the way it illuminates the fundamental paradoxes of human existence itself. We are beings who pride ourselves on rational thought and conscious choice, yet we carry within our bodies and minds capacities for experience that can sweep away all pretense of control in moments of crisis or transcendence. The dancers of Strasbourg became unwitting ambassadors from territories of consciousness that most of us spend our lives carefully avoiding, pioneers who returned with reports from regions where the familiar rules of individual autonomy and physical limitation simply do not apply. Their experience speaks to something that every human being recognizes at some level, even if we lack the vocabulary to express it clearly. We have all felt moments when the boundary between self and world becomes permeable, when music or movement or beauty dissolves the barriers that normally separate us from the larger rhythms of existence. The dancing plague represents an extreme manifestation of capacities that lie dormant in every nervous system, every body that has ever swayed to rhythm or been moved by forces beyond conscious intention. Modern life, with its emphasis on individual achievement and rational control, has created structures that tend to suppress rather than cultivate these deeper capacities for collective transcendence. We have gained enormous benefits from learning to organize society around principles of personal responsibility and logical analysis, but we may have lost touch with aspects of human nature that earlier cultures understood and incorporated into their ways of life. The dancing plague serves as a reminder that these suppressed potentials do not simply disappear but may emerge unexpectedly when conditions overwhelm our normal methods of maintaining psychological and social equilibrium. The phenomenon also reveals the profound interconnectedness that exists between individuals despite our cultural emphasis on separation and autonomy. The fact that the dancing could spread through observation, that entire communities could be swept up in shared altered states, demonstrates that human consciousness operates through channels of communication and influence that extend far beyond language or explicit coordination. We are more deeply connected to each other than our ordinary awareness typically recognizes, linked through networks of empathy and resonance that can coordinate group behavior without requiring conscious planning or verbal communication. This recognition has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity about medieval dance epidemics. In our contemporary world, we witness phenomena that share remarkable similarities with the collective altered states that characterized the dancing plague. Social media creates conditions where emotions, ideas, and behaviors can spread through populations with the same contagious rapidity that carried movement through the streets of Strasbourg. Financial markets can be seized by collective behaviors that seem to operate beyond rational calculation, driven by psychological forces that economists struggle to predict or explain. Political movements can generate mass experiences that transform ordinary individuals into participants in collective actions that feel both personally meaningful and larger than individual choice. Even our entertainment and recreational activities often seek to recreate something of the transcendent collective experience that the dancers discovered accidentally. Music festivals, sporting events, religious gatherings, and other occasions where large numbers of people can temporarily transcend the boundaries of separate existence. The enduring appeal of these experiences suggests that the human hunger for collective transcendence has not been eliminated by modern rationality, but has simply found new expressions that contemporary culture can more easily accommodate. We have learned to create structured contexts for accessing altered states and group coherence while maintaining the safety and predictability that organized society requires. Yet something may be lost in this controlled approach to extraordinary experience. some quality of authenticity and surrender that can only emerge when consciousness encounters forces that cannot be planned or managed. The dancing plague of 1518 occurred during a period of history when the certainties that had organized medieval life were beginning to dissolve, when religious authority was being challenged and economic systems were undergoing transformation. In many ways, our current era shares similar characteristics: rapid technological change, shifting social structures, and the breakdown of traditional sources of meaning and identity. These parallels suggest that we might be living through conditions that could give rise to new forms of collective altered states, new expressions of the same fundamental human capacities that manifested so dramatically in 16th century Strasbourg. Understanding the dancing plague from this perspective transforms it from a historical curiosity into a kind of field guide for recognizing and responding to the emergence of collective transcendent experiences in our own time. The phenomenon demonstrates both the potential benefits and the serious risks that accompany any departure from conventional consciousness, showing how communities can adapt to accommodate extraordinary states while working to ensure that such experiences serve healing and integration rather than disruption and harm. The resolution of the plague through pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus provides particularly valuable insights into how spiritual frameworks can serve to contain and direct collective altered states. The pilgrimage created a narrative structure that gave meaning to the dancers' experience while providing a method for safely concluding their trance states. The physical journey to the sacred site, combined with ritual contact with holy relics, offered both the dancers and their community a way to understand and integrate what had occurred within familiar religious categories. This aspect of the historical resolution suggests that successful integration of collective transcendent experiences requires more than simply ending the altered states. It demands frameworks for making meaning from what occurred, for translating extraordinary experiences into forms that ordinary consciousness can work with and learn from. Communities that lack such integrative frameworks may find themselves repeatedly overwhelmed by emergent phenomena that they can neither prevent nor productively channel. The dancing plague also demonstrates the crucial importance of maintaining compassionate and supportive responses to individuals who become involved in collective altered states. The families and neighbors who cared for the dancers throughout their weeks of involuntary movement, who brought them food and water and protected them from harm, created conditions that allowed the phenomenon to run its course without degenerating into tragedy or violence. Their patience and dedication suggest that love and practical care may be the most powerful tools available for supporting people who are navigating extraordinary states of consciousness. As we consider the legacy of those remarkable weeks in 1518, we might ask ourselves what wisdom can be extracted from this encounter with the impossible, what guidance it might offer for living with the mystery and unpredictability that characterize human existence. Perhaps the most important lesson is the recognition that our ordinary understanding of what is possible represents only a small fraction of the full spectrum of human experience and capability. The dancers of Strasbourg discovered that the human body could endure weeks of continuous movement, that consciousness could access states of awareness far removed from normal waking experience, that individuals could become part of collective processes that transcended personal will and intention. Their discovery invites us to remain open to possibilities that rational thought might dismiss, to maintain humility about the limits of our knowledge and control, to recognize that life itself contains depths of mystery that no amount of scientific progress will ever fully illuminate. At the same time, the phenomenon demonstrates the importance of developing wisdom about how to navigate extraordinary experiences safely and beneficially. The dancing plague occurred in a cultural context that lacked adequate frameworks for understanding and managing collective altered states, creating conditions where potentially healing experiences became sources of crisis and concern. Our contemporary world, with its expanded knowledge of psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology, has access to resources that might allow us to approach such phenomena with greater skill and less fear. The integration of modern scientific understanding with traditional wisdom about consciousness and community could potentially create new approaches to collective transcendence that honor both the profound human hunger for extraordinary experience and the practical requirements of social stability and individual well-being. Such approaches might allow future generations to access the transformative potentials that the dancing plague revealed while avoiding the disruption and suffering that accompanied its uncontrolled emergence. As we draw toward the close of this exploration of one of history's most mysterious and beautiful phenomena, perhaps we can allow ourselves to imagine the dancers of Strasbourg as they might exist now, centuries after their extraordinary experience has ended. In whatever realm consciousness travels when it departs from embodied life, perhaps they have found the eternal dance they seemed to be seeking during those weeks when their bodies became instruments of something larger than individual existence. Perhaps they move now in perfect rhythm with cosmic forces that medieval minds could only glimpse, their steps tracing patterns across landscapes of pure meaning and beauty, their movements finally expressing fully the transcendent realities they touched so briefly during their time in our material world. Perhaps they dance still, but now their dancing is pure joy rather than compulsion, pure expression rather than mystery, pure connection rather than the lonely seeking that drives so much of human experience. And perhaps in moments when we ourselves are touched by beauty that moves us beyond words, when music carries us outside the boundaries of ordinary consciousness, when love or wonder or grief opens us to experiences larger than our individual existence, we join briefly in that eternal dance, becoming part of the same vast rhythm that once claimed the streets of Strasbourg and transformed ordinary people into living demonstrations of human possibility. The dance continues in forms both visible and invisible, in movements both individual and collective, in rhythms both earthly and celestial. The dancers of 1518 showed us that we are all, potentially, participants in mysteries far greater than our ordinary awareness imagines, citizens of realms where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the boundaries we take for granted dissolve into the flowing interconnectedness that may be the deepest truth of existence itself. In the quiet that follows extraordinary revelation, in the stillness that allows integration of experiences too large for immediate understanding, we can rest now in appreciation for the mystery itself, for the courage of those who surrendered to forces beyond their comprehension, for the community that found ways to support and ultimately heal what it could not explain. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that human life contains possibilities that will forever exceed our ability to predict or control them, and that perhaps our wisest response to such mysteries is not to solve them, but to let them teach us about the wonder and depth of our own nature. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within yourself the same capacities for transformation and transcendence that moved the dancers of Strasbourg. That consciousness itself is far more vast and mysterious than the waking mind can comprehend, and that the dance of existence continues always, inviting us into participation whenever we are ready to surrender our illusions of separation and control to the larger rhythms that connect us all. Good night.